Before Moses sent 12 spies into the Promised Land, a lineage had already taken root in the valleys of Hebron, one born not from ordinary men, but from the mingling of heaven and earth in the days before the flood. The texts do not say when Anak first appeared in the land, only that his sons were there when the spies arrived, standing like living monuments to something the waters were meant to erase. Later writings preserve fragments of a genealogy that reaches backward through Arba, through the Anakim, to the Nephilim who walked before judgment fell. 10 of the 12 spies returned with a report that paralyzed an entire generation. We saw the sons of Anak there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own sight. What kind of lineage could reverse the courage of men chosen by God Himself? The record remains silent on much, but the scattered references, woven through canonical and extra-biblical sources, suggest that Anak's bloodline carried a memory the flood could not fully drown. The story begins in an age that the canonical text remembers only in fragments, with a brief line that feels like an echo from a much older memory. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men. The phrase is sparse, almost reluctant, yet it opens a door into a time when the boundary between heaven and earth did not yet feel fully sealed. The account in Genesis 6 speaks of sons of God taking human women, and of their offspring becoming mighty men which were of old men of renown, a designation that later traditions would understand as something more than ordinary rulers or warriors. The plain narrative does not dwell on their features or their daily lives, but it links their presence directly to a world that was filled with corruption and violence before the decree of the flood. In later centuries, voices beyond the canonical boundary would return to these few verses and unfold them into a more detailed story. The Book of Enoch names the descending beings as watchers, heavenly figures who left their appointed station on the heights to descend upon the slopes of Mount Hermon. There, according to that tradition, they bound themselves with an oath, agreeing together that they would not turn back from their course once they had taken human wives. Their leader is called Shemiheza, and among them stands another name, Azazel, whose teaching will come to represent something darker than mere curiosity. These texts describe the watchers as those entrusted with vigilance over the earth, who instead became the cause of its defilement. The narrative in Enoch lingers over what the older Genesis account hints at without detail. It speaks of how these beings taught forbidden arts, metalworking for weapons, the craft of ornamentation for seduction, the use of herbs and roots for enchantment, and the reading of the heavens for hidden meanings. What Genesis simply calls corruption is, in this expanded tradition, tied to a transformation of human society through knowledge given at the wrong time and for the wrong purpose. The Watchers' union with human women produced the Nephilim, described as great in stature and appetite, whose presence on the earth became synonymous with devouring and excess. The land, in that telling, no longer merely bore violence, it groaned under it. The canonical narrative remains more restrained, but its sequence is consistent with this darker backdrop. Immediately after mentioning these unions and the emergence of mighty men, the text records that the thoughts of the human heart were only evil continually, and that the earth was filled with violence. The link is not argued. It is simply presented as the condition of the world in which the decree of judgment was formed. God's declaration that His Spirit would not always strive with man, and that His days would be limited to a defined span reads, in this context, less as an abstract statement and more as a withdrawal from a creation that had been fundamentally altered. Some Jewish and early Christian interpreters read the sons of God as angelic beings, aligning with Enoch and other Second Temple writings. Others, particularly in later interpretive traditions, understood the phrase as referring to the descendants of Seth, the righteous line, intermarrying with the daughters of Cain. Both readings attempt to explain how the world reached a state where judgment by water seemed the only remaining remedy. Yet even where interpretations diverge, the figure of the Nephilim persists as a sign that human history at that point carried a weight unlike any other era that followed. Within this landscape, the Nephilim are not presented simply as tall men, but as a kind of culmination of transgression, beings whose very existence testified that the created order had been crossed. The etymology of their name has been debated, whether from a root meaning to fall or to cause to fall, and the texts do not resolve the question. What is clear is that they are listed alongside the corruption of all flesh and the ruin of the earth. Their stories, preserved in hints and later elaborations, stand at the threshold of the flood narrative like sentinels of a vanished age. The Book of the Watchers, the earliest portion of Enoch, gives numbers and heights for these beings, often exaggerated in a way that feels symbolic as much as literal. Their appetites, it says, became so great that when the earth could no longer sustain them, they turned on humanity itself. Whether these details reflect literal memory, mythic amplification, or a theological portrait of sin's expansion, the effect is the same: a world devoured from within by the consequences of a broken boundary. The flood, in such a reading, does not appear as an arbitrary punishment, but as the slow, sorrowful decision to cleanse a creation that had become unrecognizable. Amid this growing darkness, the canonical text briefly introduces one figure without yet pausing to explain his role: Noah, a man described as righteous in his generation, perfect in his generations, and one who walked with God. The phrase about his generations has drawn comment across centuries, some seeing in it a reference to moral integrity, others wondering whether it hints at a lineage preserved from the corruption that had spread through intermingled unions. The text itself does not elaborate. It simply presents Noah as a contrast to the pervasive ruin around him. The genealogies leading up to Noah, from Adam through Seth, trace a line of fathers and sons with ages that stretch beyond modern experience, forming a bridge between the first man and the one through whom a new beginning will come. Within that list appear names that later traditions will revisit: Enoch, who walked with God and was not, and Lamech, who names his son Noah with a hope that he will bring relief from the toil of cursed ground. These earlier hints deepen the sense that the coming flood is not a sudden decision, but the end of a long, watched decline. Even within the sober narrative of Genesis, there is a sense that something more than human wickedness alone is in view. Phrases like "all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth" suggest a wider disarray in the created order. The flood decree addresses both man and beast, creeping things and birds, as if the damage had spread outward from its point of origin to touch every living realm. Later writings that speak of the Watchers and their offspring simply take this implication and give it faces and names, placing upon specific beings the blame that the earlier text distributes across a ruined world. As the story moves closer to the waters that will cover the earth, the presence of the Watchers and their giant offspring stands in the background like an unfinished sentence. The canonical account will not return to their height or their deeds in any detail, and yet, in a brief remark during the reconnaissance of Canaan generations later, the memory will surface again. The descendants of Anak are linked to the Nephilim, and we were in our own sight as grasshoppers. That echo suggests that whatever happened before the flood cast a shadow long enough to be recognized far beyond it. In this first age, before the waters rose, the world carried a weight of secrets that later eras would only glimpse through scattered lines and fragments. The descent of the Watchers, the birth of the Nephilim, the spread of forbidden knowledge, and the thickening of violence together formed the atmosphere into which the ark would eventually be built. The narrative now stands on the brink of that decision, where heaven will answer the corruption of earth not by argument, but by opening the fountains of the deep. The construction of the ark took place over years that the text does not narrate in detail. Yet within those years the world continued as before, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge what was coming. Jesus would later recall this era in passing, describing how people in the days of Noah ate and drank, married and were given in marriage, until the flood came and took them all away. The portrait is not one of obvious catastrophe in the streets, but of ordinary life continuing alongside extraordinary corruption, a society functioning while moving steadily toward its own erasure. The ark itself, massive in its dimensions and purpose, must have stood as a silent testimony for decades while those around it carried on with their transactions, their celebrations, their violence. Within the extra-biblical tradition preserved in Enoch, there is a darker thread that runs parallel to the building of the ark. The text describes how the Nephilim, whose appetites had grown beyond the earth's ability to sustain them, began to turn upon humanity itself, and then upon one another. The angelic instruction given to Gabriel, as recorded in that account, commands that the children of the watchers be sent against each other, that they might destroy one another in battle. Whether understood as literal history or theological commentary, the passage presents a vision of self-consuming violence, a world that had begun to devour its own children. This is the atmosphere into which the decree of the flood is spoken, not as interruption but as conclusion. The judgment upon the watchers themselves, according to these later writings, was not delayed until the flood. Enoch describes their confinement to a place of darkness, bound until a final day of reckoning. Their offspring, the Nephilim, were appointed for destruction through the waters, and their disembodied spirits were said to remain as sources of oppression after their physical forms were erased. The canonical text does not elaborate on such details, but it does preserve a sequence. After the mention of the Nephilim and the corruption of all flesh, the next decisive action is the command to Noah to build an ark, and the declaration that the end of all flesh had come before God. The dimensions given for the ark are precise, almost technical, a sharp contrast to the mythic scale of earlier verses. 300 cubits in length, 50 in breadth, 30 in height, with lower, second, and third stories, details that anchor the narrative in something concrete, as if to remind the reader that this judgment, however cosmic in scope, will play out through material means. Noah is instructed not only to build, but to gather pairs of every living thing, provisions for sustenance, a careful preservation of seed and breath in the midst of total erasure. The ark becomes a reversal of the corruption that preceded it, a contained order set against a chaotic world. As the narrative approaches the moment when the waters will be released, the contrast between Noah's household and the surrounding world sharpens. The phrase "Noah was a just man and perfect in his generations" has been read through varying lenses across centuries. Some Jewish interpreters saw in "perfect in his generations" a hint that his genealogy had remained unmixed, untouched by the unions that produced the Nephilim. Others understood it simply as moral integrity within a corrupt age. The text itself does not resolve the ambiguity, but the placement of the phrase, immediately after the mention of giants and violence, invites the connection. The flood, when it finally arrives, is described not merely as rain but as the breaking open of two sources, the fountains of the great deep and the windows of heaven. The imagery suggests a cosmos collapsing inward, the ordered separation of waters above and below, established in the creation account, now reversed. What God had divided, he now allowed to converge. The duration is carefully noted, 40 days and nights of rain, but a much longer period before the waters receded and the earth became habitable again. During those months, everything outside the ark that had the breath of life in its nostrils perished. The narrative does not linger on the death itself. It simply records the totality of it. In the extra-biblical literature, particularly the Book of Jubilees, the purpose of the flood is stated more explicitly: to rid the earth of the Nephilim. The violence and corruption attributed to these beings is presented as the immediate cause, not merely a symptom of broader wickedness. Whether this interpretation reflects the intent of the Genesis author or a later theological development, it shaped how Second Temple Judaism understood the antediluvian world. The Watchers, the Nephilim, and the forbidden knowledge they brought became, in this reading, the central actors in a drama that required divine intervention on a planetary scale. When the waters finally receded and Noah opened the door of the ark, the world he stepped into was emptied. The text does not describe ruins or remnants. It simply notes dry ground and the release of animals. Every piece of evidence of the civilization that had existed before was erased, leaving only the brief account in Genesis and the expanded memories preserved in later writings. The genealogies, the names of the Watchers, the cities, the metallurgy, the enchantments, none of it survived in physical form. What remained was the knowledge that such a world had existed, and that it had been judged so thoroughly that only 8 human souls were carried through the boundary between ages. Yet even as the ark comes to rest on the mountains of Ararat and Noah builds an altar, the narrative does not declare the problem of evil solved. God's covenant with Noah includes a promise never again to destroy all flesh by water, but it also includes an acknowledgement that the imagination of man's heart is evil from his youth. The flood cleansed the earth, but it did not cleanse human nature. And within that recognition lies a shadow that will stretch forward through the genealogies that follow. The Nephilim, drowned and buried beneath reshaped Kentin, Ents will somehow reappear in the reconnaissance reports of Israelite spies centuries later, their name attached to the sons of Anak in the land of Canaan. This strange echo, we saw the Nephilim there, will trouble interpreters for generations. Did the flood fail to erase them completely? Did the corruption re-emerge through a different lineage? The text in Numbers 13 does not explain. It simply records the terror of the spies and the comparison they made between themselves and the sons of Anak. Whether the reference is literal genealogy or symbolic association, it ties the post-flood world back to the age before the waters rose, suggesting that something of that first darkness had found a way forward. The story of Anak, then, does not begin in Canaan, but here, in the days when the boundary between heaven and earth was first violated, and judgment became inevitable. The flood ended with a covenant and a promise, yet the genealogies that follow Noah's sons carry within them a quiet mystery that the text does not pause to explain. Genesis 6:4 contains a phrase that has troubled interpreters across centuries. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that. The word afterward opens a door that the narrative itself does not walk through, leaving the question suspended. If the waters destroyed all flesh that was not sheltered in the ark, how could giants reappear in the land generations later? The canonical text offers no direct answer, yet scattered through the historical books of the Old Testament are references to peoples described as unusually tall, often associated with territories that Israel would later be commanded to conquer. The first mention of these post-flood giants appears not in a dramatic revelation, but in a brief note within a military report. Genesis 14 describes a confederation of kings led by Chedorlaomer, who swept through the regions east of the Jordan Valley, striking down several peoples in succession. The text lists them without elaboration: the Rephaim in Ashtaroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim. At first reading, these sound like ordinary tribal names, yet later passages will clarify that each of these groups was remembered for something other than their political allegiances. They were remembered for their height. Deuteronomy, written centuries after the events it describes, returns to these names and fills in what Genesis left unexplained. The Emim, it says, were a people great and numerous and tall as the Anakim, and were regarded as Rephaim, though the Moabites who displaced them called them by a different name. Similarly, the Zamzummim, called Rephaim elsewhere, were destroyed by the Ammonites who settled in their place. The land itself is described as a land of giants, a designation that suggests not merely the presence of a few tall individuals, but entire populations recognized for their stature. These retrospective notes reveal that by the time of Abraham, and certainly by the time of Moses, the memory of giant peoples inhabiting the lands around Canaan was not in dispute. What remained contested was how they came to be there after the flood. One interpretive tradition holds that the reappearance of giants indicates a renewed incursion, a repetition of the transgression that occurred before the flood. According to this view, sons of God, whether understood as fallen angels or another order of beings, again took human wives, producing offspring of extraordinary size and strength. This explanation treats the post-flood giants as a second generation of Nephilim, distinct from but parallel to the first. The narrative silence on this matter in the canonical text leaves room for such speculation, though it also means that no explicit confirmation exists within the Torah itself. Another reading, more cautious in its claims, suggests that the giant peoples descended from Noah's sons through ordinary human inheritance. This view points to the fact that genetic diversity carried through the 8 souls aboard the ark could have included the traits for unusual height, which later re-emerged in isolated populations. In this interpretation, the term Nephilim, as used by the frightened spies in Numbers 13, is not a claim of literal genealogical descent from pre-flood beings, but a comparison, a way of saying that the sons of Anak reminded them of the ancient stories their ancestors told about the giants who lived before judgment came. The phrase descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim would then be understood as the spies' fearful association, not as verified lineage. Regardless of origin, the presence of these peoples is woven into the fabric of the patriarchal narratives without fanfare. When God speaks to Abraham in Genesis 15, promising him the land for his descendants, he lists the nations currently inhabiting it: the Kenites, Kenizzites, Cadmonites, Hittites, Perizzites, Rephaim, Amorites, Canaanites, Girgashites, and Jebusites. Among these, the Rephaim stand as one name among many, not yet singled out for their stature, though later texts will make clear what Genesis 15 does not emphasize. The promise carries within it an implication. These peoples, including those of extraordinary size, will be displaced. Abraham himself will later encounter one of their kings in battle. Genesis 14 recounts how Abraham, upon hearing that his nephew Lot had been taken captive by Chedorlaomer's alliance, armed his trained servants and pursued the raiding kings northward. The narrative presents this as a rescue mission, not a conquest, yet the detail is significant. Abraham defeated the very coalition that had just swept through the territories of the Rephaim, Zuzim, and Emim. The text does not call this a victory over giants, but the earlier verses make clear whom Chedorlaomer had defeated before taking Lo. Abraham's success, then, prefigures what his descendants would later accomplish on a larger scale: the displacement of peoples who had seemed immovable. The Amorites receive particular attention in the divine speech to Abraham. God tells him that his descendants will return to claim the land after 4 generations, for the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. The phrase links the timing of Israel's inheritance to the moral condition of the current inhabitants, suggesting that the conquest will come not merely as military expansion, but as judgment. Later passages will associate the Amorites with the giant peoples, either as allies or as a broader category that included groups like the Anakim. Their wickedness and their stature become intertwined in the biblical memory, though the text never claims that height itself constitutes sin. By the time Moses leads Israel out of Egypt, the giant peoples are not distant legends but present obstacles. The reconnaissance mission into Canaan returns with a report that focuses as much on the inhabitants as on the fertility of the land. The spies describe fortified cities and peoples of great strength, and they name the Anakim specifically as descendants dwelling in the hill country. Their conclusion is stark. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. This testimony is not framed as mythology or exaggeration within the narrative. It is presented as the reason an entire generation refused to enter the land and was condemned to wander until they perished. The names multiply as the story progresses: Rephaim, Emim, Zamzumim, Anakim. Each appears in specific geographic contexts, tied to particular regions east and west of the Jordan. The Rephaim are associated with Bashan and the valley that would later bear their name near Jerusalem. The Emim occupied the land that the Moabites would inherit. The Zamzumim held the territory that became Ammon. The Anakim, however, are concentrated in the hill country of Judah, particularly around Hebron, and it is their lineage that will carry the weight of Israel's fear forward through the conquest narratives. Deuteronomy preserves a retrospective commentary on these peoples, noting that God himself destroyed the giants to make room for the nations descended from Lot, Moab, and Ammon, just as he would later dispossess the Canaanite giants to make room for Israel. The pattern suggests divine orchestration, a clearing of the land that preceded Israel's arrival by generations. Yet within this providential reading lies an acknowledgement that these were not minor tribes or scattered families. They were formidable, numerous, and entrenched, requiring divine intervention for their removal. The question of how these peoples came to possess such strength and stature has generated theological reflection across centuries, yet the biblical text itself remains more interested in geography than genealogy. The land of Bashan, ruled by Og at the time of Israel's approach, is described as the land of the Rephaim. His bed, made of iron, measured 9 cubits in length and 4 in breadth, roughly 13.5 feet long, and was preserved as a relic in Arba of the Ammonites long after his death. The detail is unusual in its specificity, as if the narrator anticipated skepticism and offered material evidence that could be verified by later generations. Whether the measurement refers to a literal bed or a sarcophagus, the purpose is clear. Og was remembered as exceptional even among those already known for their size. The Rephaim appear not only as a specific people, but as a broader category under which other giant groups are classified. Deuteronomy 2 explains that the Emim were considered Rephaim by surrounding nations, though the Moabites used a different local name for them. The same linguistic pattern applies to the Zamzumim, whom the Ammonites called by that name, but who were also regarded as Rephaim. This suggests that Rephaim functioned as both an ethnic designation and a general term for peoples of extraordinary stature, much like giant in English carries both literal and metaphorical weight. The overlap in terminology has made it difficult for later interpreters to determine whether these were distinct tribes or regional variations of a common ancestry. Jewish tradition, preserved in sources like the Book of Jubilees, offers one explanation for the reappearance of giants after the flood. According to this text, Noah's son Ham had a wife whose lineage may have carried the traits or the corruption associated with the pre-flood Nephilim. This interpretation does not appear in the canonical Genesis account, but it attempts to resolve the tension between the totality of the flood's destruction and the later presence of giant peoples. Whether understood as genetic inheritance, spiritual corruption, or symbolic association, the tradition reflects an ancient need to explain continuity between the two ages. Another strand of interpretation found in early Christian writings and some rabbinic discussions, suggests that the sons of God who came to human women were not limited to the pre-flood era. This view treats Genesis 6:4's phrase, and also after that, as evidence of a second incursion, one that occurred after the waters receded but before the time of Abraham. The canonical text does not describe such an event, but the interpretive tradition uses the reappearance of giants as circumstantial evidence that something similar to the first transgression occurred again. In this reading, the post-flood giants are not merely tall humans, but the offspring of a renewed boundary crossing. Yet the simplest reading of the biblical narrative treats these peoples as human descendants of Noah's line, who developed or retained unusual physical traits through natural inheritance. Genesis 10, the Table of Nations, traces the spread of humanity after the flood through Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Among Ham's descendants is Canaan, whose lineage will come to occupy the very territories where giants are later found. The Canaanites, Jebusites, Amorites, and others listed in Genesis 10 are not initially described as giants, but as nations spreading into specific geographic regions. Over generations, isolated populations in mountainous or fortified areas may have developed distinctive physical characteristics, including height, through both genetics and selective pressures. What remains consistent across all interpretive approaches is the biblical testimony that by the time Israel approached the Promised Land, giant peoples were established and recognized. The reconnaissance report in Numbers 13 does not present the Anakim as a legend requiring verification. The spies saw them, measured themselves against them, and concluded that conquest was impossible. Their testimony paralyzed an entire nation for a generation, not because they claimed to have seen mythical creatures, but because they reported an obstacle that seemed insurmountable within ordinary military calculation. The Anakim themselves will later be understood as descendants of a figure named Anak, whose father Arba was remembered as the greatest man among the Anakim and the founder of Arba, later called Hebron. The genealogy is sparse, offering no dates or narratives, only names that anchor a lineage in a specific place. Yet that place, Hebron, carries weight in the patriarchal memory. Abraham purchased a burial cave there for Sarah, and the patriarchs themselves would eventually be interred in that same location. The land where giants dwelt was the same land where the fathers of Israel chose to bury their dead, a detail that underscores the contested nature of the territory from the earliest generations. The biblical writers seem less interested in resolving the theological puzzle of the giants' origin than in documenting their presence and eventual removal. Deuteronomy 2 and 3 recount how God dispossessed the Rephaim to make room for the descendants of Lot, and how he would do the same for Israel. The pattern is presented as consistent divine action. Nations rise and fall, territories change hands, and peoples once considered invincible are destroyed to fulfill promises made generations earlier. The giants in this framework are not eternal adversaries, but temporary inhabitants whose time in the land had an appointed end. By the era of the patriarchs, the giant peoples were an accepted reality, a feature of the landscape as fixed as mountains or rivers. Abraham encountered them indirectly through the coalition that had defeated them. Isaac lived in proximity to their territories without direct conflict recorded. Jacob's sons would grow into a people in Egypt, while the Anakim and their kin remained entrenched in Canaan, unaware that a promise spoken centuries earlier was moving slowly toward fulfillment. The land they occupied had been measured and promised to a man who owned nothing in it but a cave. The silence of the text on the mechanics of the giants' reappearance leaves room for speculation, but it also forces attention toward what the narrative does emphasize: that these peoples existed, that they were formidable, and that their presence would test Israel's faith in divine promises. The fear they inspired was not irrational. It was grounded in observable reality. The question was never whether the sons of Anak were tall, but whether the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt could bring them into a land defended by peoples who seemed, by all human measure, unconquerable. As the story moves from the patriarchs toward the Exodus and the wilderness, the giant peoples remain in place, growing in reputation and entrenchment. Their cities were fortified, their warriors trained, their lineages deep. Among them, the Anakim stood as the most concentrated and feared group, dwelling in the hill country that would become the inheritance of Judah. Our forefather Anak had already lived and died by the time the spies entered the land, but his sons carried his name forward, and in doing so, became the standard by which an entire generation measured impossibility. The survival of giants after the flood, however it occurred, had become the obstacle that would define Israel's wilderness years and shape the faith of those who finally crossed the Jordan. The name surfaces first in Genesis without explanation, embedded in a narrative about death and burial. When Sarah dies in the land of Canaan, the text records that Abraham mourned for her in Arba, that is, Hebron. The parenthetical note suggests that the reader might not recognize the older name, yet no context is given for why the city bore that designation or who Arba was. The narrative moves forward to Abraham's negotiation with Ephron the Hittite for the cave of Machpelah, and Arba is mentioned again only as a geographic marker. It is not until the Book of Joshua, written centuries later, that the name receives its fuller weight. Now the name of Hebron formerly was Arba, which Arba was the greatest man among the Anakim. The designation greatest man appears without elaboration, offering no details of Arba's deeds, his reign, or the circumstances of his prominence. The Hebrew phrase translated as the greatest man can also carry the sense of the great man, a title rather than a comparison. Whether this means he was the tallest, the oldest, the most powerful, or simply the founder is left unresolved by the text. What is clear is that his name became attached to the city in such a way that even after the Israelite conquest, the older designation lingered in memory. Joshua 15:13 adds a single genealogical detail. Arba was the father of Anak. This brief statement anchors an entire lineage, connecting the feared Anakim directly to the man whose name the city bore. The meaning of the name itself has invited speculation across generations. In Hebrew, Arba means four, and interpreters have offered various explanations for why a man or a city would carry such a numerical designation. One rabbinic tradition suggests that Arba means city of the four and refers to the four patriarchs allegedly buried there: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Adam. This interpretation transforms the name from a reference to Arba the giant into a memorial for revered ancestors, effectively erasing the connection to the Anakim. Yet this reading is not supported by the biblical text itself, which consistently attributes the name to Arba as a person, not as a symbolic number. Another interpretation treats four as a reference to a confederation or alliance, suggesting that Arba ruled over four clans, or that the city was a union of four settlements. This explanation attempts to account for his prominence among the Anakim by portraying him as a unifying figure, one whose leadership extended beyond a single tribe. Yet once again, the text offers no confirmation of such a structure, leaving the theory dependent on inference rather than explicit statement. The simplicity of the biblical account, Arba was the father of Anak, suggests that his significance lay not in political achievement but in lineage. What the narrative does make clear is that by the time Abraham arrived in Canaan, Arba was already established and associated with the Anakim. When Abraham speaks with Ephron the Hittite about purchasing the cave, the transaction takes place at the gate of his city. a phrase that indicates urban infrastructure and legal procedure. The city was not a primitive settlement but a functioning community with recognized property rights and witnesses to contracts. Ephron himself is described as a Hittite, yet he lives in Arba, a city named for a giant. This suggests that the population of the city was mixed, or that the Anakim coexisted with other peoples in the region during the patriarchal era. The fact that Abraham chose to bury Sarah in a city named for the father of the Anakim is never remarked upon within the text, yet it adds a layer of tension to the narrative. The cave of Machpelah, purchased at full price and witnessed by the inhabitants of Arba, becomes the burial site not only for Sarah, but eventually for Abraham, Isaac, Rebekah, Leah, and Jacob. The patriarchs, to whom the land was promised, own nothing in Canaan except a tomb in a city controlled by giants. This irony is not lost on later readers, though the biblical narrator does not pause to highlight it. The genealogy linking Arba to Anak is stated without embellishment, but it carries enormous narrative weight. Anak's sons, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, are the figures who will terrify the Israelite spies centuries later. The line of descent runs clearly. Arba begot Anak. Anak begot the 3 sons who ruled Hebron when Israel approached, and those 3 represent the culmination of a lineage that stretched back to the greatest man among the Anakim. Whether Arba himself was a descendant of the pre-flood Nephilim, a survivor of the Rephaim driven from the east, or simply the progenitor of a naturally tall population, the text does not say. His legacy exists entirely in the fact that his name endured long enough to become a city's identity. Hebron itself occupies a unique position in the biblical geography. It is situated in the hill country of Judah, elevated above the surrounding valleys, a natural stronghold. Later texts describe it as one of the cities given to Caleb as an inheritance, specifically because he had the faith to face the Anakim when others did not. The renaming, or re-identification, of Arba as Hebron marks a transition from the age of giants to the age of Israel, yet the older name persists in memory, attached to the figure who founded or defined the city in the era before Abraham. The silence surrounding Arba's life is as significant as what is stated. No battles are recorded, no treaties made, no speeches given. He appears only as a name, a designation, and a genealogical anchor. This restraint distinguishes the biblical account from mythological traditions that typically glorify or demonize founding figures. Arba is neither celebrated nor condemned. He simply is the father of Anak, the man after whom the city was named. His greatness is acknowledged without explanation, leaving later readers to infer what made him the greatest among a people already known for their stature. The association of his name with the number 4 has led some scholars to consider whether the designation was originally a title rather than a personal name. In ancient Near Eastern contexts, numbers could carry symbolic or hierarchical significance, and the 4 might have indicated rank or role within a confederation. Yet the biblical text treats Arba consistently as a proper name, not as a descriptor, which complicates efforts to read it symbolically. The tension between the literal meaning of the name and its function in the narrative remains unresolved, a minor mystery embedded in the genealogy of giants. By the time Joshua leads Israel into Canaan, Arba is long dead, yet his influence persists through the city that bears his name and the descendants who inhabit it. The Anakim dwelling in Hebron are not strangers who arrived recently. They are the continuation of a lineage rooted in the land for generations. Their presence is not accidental but historical, the result of a founding figure whose name had become inseparable from the place itself. To conquer Hebron, Israel would have to displace not merely a garrison but a legacy, one that reached back through Anak to the man called the greatest among the Anakim. The connection between Arba and the broader category of the Rephaim is never explicitly stated in the canonical text, yet the geographic and temporal overlaps suggest a relationship that later Jewish tradition would attempt to clarify. The Rephaim are mentioned as early as Genesis 14, when Chedorlaomer and his allies struck them down in Ashtaroth Karnaim. By the time of Deuteronomy, the term Rephaim functions as a general designation for giant peoples, under which the Emim, Zamzumim, and others are classified. Whether the Anakim were also considered Rephaim or represented a distinct lineage is not directly addressed, though Deuteronomy 2:11 notes that the Emim were considered Rephaim, like the Anakim, suggesting a comparison rather than identity. Arba's position as the greatest among the Anakim places him at the head of a lineage that, if not identical to the Rephaim, was at least parallel in reputation and stature. The founding of Kiriath Arba cannot be dated with precision, but its existence during Abraham's lifetime places it well before the Exodus and conquest. Abraham arrived in Canaan around the early 2nd millennium BCE, according to traditional chronology, and the city was already established enough to have recognized legal procedures and a settled population. This suggests that Arba, if he was indeed the founder, lived at least a generation or more before Abraham's arrival, making him a contemporary of the period when the giant peoples were consolidating their control over the highlands of Canaan. His death is not recorded, nor is the manner of his rule or the circumstances of the city's founding. The text treats him as a figure from the past even in Joshua's time, preserved in collective memory primarily through the name of the city. The choice of Hebron as the site of the patriarchal burial cave adds a layer of theological irony that the biblical writers leave largely implicit. The land promised to Abraham and his descendants was, at the time of the promise, occupied by peoples who seemed immovable. The only portion Abraham ever owned was purchased from a Hittite in a city named for the father of the Anakim. Isaac and Jacob, who also received the promise, were likewise buried in soil that remained under the control of the very peoples their descendants were meant to displace. The contrast between divine promise and immediate reality could not be sharper, yet the patriarchs chose this location, perhaps because of its elevated position, its central location in the hill country, or its symbolic significance as a place where heaven and earth seemed to meet. Later Jewish tradition LD emphasized Hebron's sanctity, eventually claiming that it was one of the oldest cities in the world and a site of cosmic importance. Some rabbinic sources describe it as the gateway to the Garden of Eden or the location where Adam and Eve were buried, interpretations that transform Kiriath Arba from a city of giants into a city of origins. These later embellishments, however creative, shift attention away from what the biblical text itself emphasizes, that this was Arba's city, named for him, and inhabited by his descendants through Anak. The sanctification of the site in Jewish memory required, in a sense, a forgetting, or at least a reframing, of its association with the Anakim. The name Arba, as a numerical designation, has also been connected to architectural or territorial features. Some scholars have suggested that the 4 refers to the 4 quarters of the city, a common ancient Near Eastern urban structure where a central crossroads divided the settlement into distinct districts. This interpretation treats Kiriath Arba as City of the 4 Quarters, a purely topographic designation unrelated to any individual. Yet this reading requires ignoring the explicit statement in Joshua 14:15 that Arba was a man, the greatest man among the Anakim. The biblical writers clearly understood Arba as a personal name, not as a geographic description, even if the original etymology may have carried numerical significance. Another dimension of Arba's legacy lies in what his descendants became. Anak, his son, is never described as a warrior or ruler in his own right. He exists in the text solely as a progenitor. The three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, are the active figures in the narrative, the ones who occupy Hebron when the spies arrive and whom Caleb will later drive out. This generational structure suggests that Arba's greatness was not in personal conquest, but in founding a lineage that would dominate the region for centuries. His name attached itself to the city not because he ruled it in strength, but because he established it, and his descendants after him maintained control long enough for the association to become permanent. The renaming of Arba to Hebron after the Israelite conquest is noted in Joshua 14:15, though the text does not explain the significance of the new name. Hebron may derive from a Hebrew root meaning alliance or association, possibly reflecting a new political reality or a theological claim that the city now belonged to the covenant people. The shift from a name honoring the father of the Anakim to a name signifying union or fellowship marks a symbolic reversal, the replacement of one identity with another. Yet even in later biblical books, the older name occasionally resurfaces, as if the memory of Arba could not be entirely erased. The biblical genealogies, sparse as they are, place Arba at a critical juncture in the story of the Anakim. Before him, the origins of the giant peoples remain unclear, debated, wrapped in the ambiguity of Genesis 6:4 and the scattered references to Rephaim in the patriarchal age. After him, the line becomes traceable. Arba begot Anak, Anak begot Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, and these three became the embodiment of the fear that paralyzed Israel at Kadesh Barnea. Arba, then, functions as the hinge between the anonymous giant peoples of the past and the named adversaries of Israel's future. His designation as the greatest man among the Anakim also raises questions about what constituted greatness in that context. Was it physical stature, making him the tallest even among a people known for height? Was it longevity, a man who lived long enough to see his descendants multiply and his city flourish? Was it wisdom or strength in battle, qualities that the text does not record but that might explain why his name endured? The biblical writers offer no clarification, leaving the phrase to carry its own weight without interpretation. The restraint is characteristic of the biblical approach to the giants, which acknowledges their existence and significance without dwelling on the details that later tradition would eagerly supply. The fact that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob chose to be buried in Arba, knowing it was the city of Arba, the father of Anak, suggests that the patriarchs did not view the Anakim as demonic or spiritually defiling in the way that later theology might imply. They purchased land, conducted legal transactions, and entrusted their bodies to a cave in a city controlled by giants. This pragmatic engagement with the inhabitants of the land, even those of extraordinary stature, stands in contrast to the later command to utterly destroy the Canaanite peoples. The difference may reflect changing theological perspectives across centuries, or it may simply indicate that the patriarchs, as sojourners without military power, had no choice but to negotiate with whoever held the land. By the time Caleb stands before Joshua and requests Hebron as his inheritance, the city's identity has fully shifted from a place named for the greatest of the Anakim to a contested prize in the conquest. Caleb's words in Joshua 14 reflect confidence born of long memory. He recalls the reconnaissance mission 40 years earlier, the report of the spies, and the fear that spread through the camp. Now, as an old man, he asks for the very territory that had once symbolized impossibility. The narrative does not dwell on Arba at this moment, but his presence hovers in the background. This is his city, named for him, and Caleb is asking for permission to erase that legacy. The story of Arba, then, is a story told almost entirely in negative space. He is the name behind a city, the father of a progenitor, the greatest among a people who will be displaced. He lived, founded or ruled, had a son, and died, leaving behind only a designation that would survive for centuries until it was finally replaced. Through him, the lineage of the Anakim gains a genealogical anchor, a point of origin that allows the biblical writers to trace a line from the distant past through Anak to the sons who will stand against Israel. In that sense, Arba's greatness lies not in what he did, but in what came after him, a legacy measured not in deeds but in descendants. Anak enters the biblical record not through narrative but through genealogy, a name positioned between his father Arba and his three sons, serving as the link in a chain that would define an entire people. The Book of Numbers identifies him simply as a forefather of the Anakim, a designation that suggests his role was generational rather than heroic. Unlike the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, whose lives are detailed through stories of altars, covenants, and journeys, Anak appears only in passing references, his existence acknowledged but never dramatized. He is the silent progenitor, the man whose name became synonymous with a race, yet whose own deeds, if there were any, went unrecorded. The etymology of his name has been debated, though most scholars trace it to a Hebrew root meaning long-necked or necklace, a term that may have originally referred to physical stature or ornamentation. The Hebrew word Anak can denote a necklace or chain worn around the neck, and by extension came to suggest someone of exceptional height, whose neck appeared elongated in proportion to ordinary men. Whether the name was given to him at birth or became attached to him later, because of his descendants' stature, is impossible to determine from the text. What is clear is that by the time the Israelite spies entered Canaan, Anakim had become a collective designation for the giant peoples dwelling in the hill country, and that designation traced back to this single figure. Anak is described as the son of Arba, the greatest man among the Anakim, placing him one generation removed from the city's founder. This positioning suggests that Anak lived during the period when Arba was already established, inheriting a legacy rather than creating one. If Arba's greatness lay in founding or consolidating the Anakim as a recognized people, Anak's role appears to have been continuation, maintaining the lineage and passing it forward to the next generation. The text offers no indication that he expanded the city, led military campaigns, or engaged in the kinds of activities that typically warrant historic, a L Chinese letter, a tion. His significance is entirely genealogical, a father whose sons would become famous, or infamous, in ways that he himself apparently did not. The three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, are named consistently across multiple biblical texts, suggesting that their identities were well established in Israelite memory. Joshua 15:14 records that Caleb drove out the three sons of Anak, Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai from Hebron. Judges 1:10 and 1:20 repeat the same three names, confirming that these were not generic references to sons of Anak in a broad sense, but specific individuals who ruled or inhabited Hebron at the time of the conquest. The preservation of their names indicates that they were known figures, leaders or chiefs whose presence was significant enough to be remembered. The relationship between Anak and his sons raises questions about the chronology that the text does not fully resolve. If Anak was the forefather of the Anakim and his three sons were the ones dwelling in Hebron when the Israelite spies arrived, then either Anak lived an extraordinarily long life, or the term sons of Anak refers to descendants several generations removed. Numbers 13:22 mentions that the spies saw the descendants of Anak there. using language that could indicate immediate offspring or later generations. The Hebrew phrasing does not demand direct paternity, and sons of often functions as a broader term for lineage or clan membership in ancient Near Eastern contexts. Some interpreters have suggested that Anak functioned both as a personal name and as a designation for the entire race, much as Israel could refer to Jacob the individual or to the nation descended from him. In this reading, Anak the person was the eponymous ancestor, and Anakim simply meant those who belonged to Anak's line. This would explain why the text can speak of Arba being a great man among the Anakim, even though Arba was Anak's father. The term Anakim would already have been in use as a tribal or ethnic designation before Anak himself was born, and he became the defining figure within that broader category. Yet the biblical writers do not clarify this distinction, leaving the relationship between the name and the people ambiguous. The association of Anak with the Nephilim is made explicitly by the frightened spies in Numbers 13:33. We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. This statement has fueled centuries of debate about whether the Anakim were literally descended from the pre-flood giants, or whether the spies were speaking metaphorically, using Nephilim as a term for any people of overwhelming size and strength. Deuteronomy 2:11 adds another layer, noting that the Anakim, like the Emim, were considered Rephaim, linking them to the broader category of post-flood giant peoples. This connection is genealogical, cultural, or simply descriptive remains contested. Anak's life, if it can be called a life in the narrative sense, exists entirely in the space between his father and his sons. He is the hinge, the necessary link that allows the biblical writers to trace a continuous lineage from Arba to the three chiefs who ruled Hebron at the time of the conquest. Without him, the genealogy would have a gap, and the claim that the Anakim were a unified people with a traceable ancestry would be weakened. His function in the text is structural, providing continuity where the narrative itself offers no stories. The silence surrounding his deeds is conspicuous when compared to other founding figures in the biblical tradition. Nimrod, for example, is remembered as a mighty hunter before the Lord and the founder of several cities. Arphaxad, Peleg, and others in the genealogies of Genesis 10:11 are similarly named without detailed stories, yet the brevity of those mentions is explained by their placement in a list designed to move quickly through generations. Anak, however, appears in contexts where details about his sons are provided, making his own absence from active narrative even more notable. It is as if the biblical writers knew who his sons were but had nothing to say about Anak himself, except that he existed and fathered them. This absence has led some scholars to propose that Anak may have been a later insertion into the genealogy, a figure created to provide an ancestral link for the Anakim after their displacement. According to this theory, the Anakim were originally known simply as inhabitants of Kiriath Arba, and the figure of Anak was invented or emphasized during the exilic or post-exilic period to systematize the tradition. Yet this reconstruction depends on assumptions about textual development that the manuscripts themselves do not confirm, and the consistent mention of Anak across multiple biblical books suggests that his name was well established in Israelite tradition by the time these texts were written. What can be said with certainty is that by the time Joshua led Israel into Canaan, the name Anak was firmly attached to the giant peoples of Hebron. Whether he was a historical individual, a legendary ancestor, or a symbolic figure representing the consolidation of the Anakim as a distinct group, his name had become inseparable from the identity of those who terrified the spies and resisted Israel's conquest. His legacy, then, was not in what he accomplished, but in what he transmitted, a lineage, a reputation, and a name that would become synonymous with the fear of the impossible. The designation of Anak as a forefather, rather than a king or warrior, suggests that his importance was recognized retrospectively, defined by what his descendants became rather than by his own achievements. In ancient genealogical thinking, a forefather was not merely the biological parent but the defining ancestor, the one whose name and identity shaped the character of all who came after. Abraham is called the forefather of Israel not only because he was the first patriarch, but because the promises given to him determined the destiny of his descendants. Similarly, Anak's role as forefather implies that the Anakim understood themselves as his people, carrying his identity forward through generations. The absence of narrative detail about Anak's birth, upbringing, or death stands in sharp contrast to the treatment of other significant figures in the conquest narratives. Og, king of Bashan, another giant figure, is described in terms of his military defeat, the dimensions of his bed, and the territory he controlled. The Rephaim are mentioned in connection with specific geographic locations and military campaigns. Even Arba receives the designation the greatest man among the Anakim, a phrase that suggests renown during his lifetime. Anak, however, is given no such descriptors. He is simply the father of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, and through them, the ancestor of the Anakim as a whole. This pattern suggests that Anak may have lived during a transitional period, a time when the Anakim were consolidating their identity, but had not yet come into direct conflict with other major powers in the region. If Arba represented the founding generation, establishing Goliath Arba and achieving prominence among the giant peoples, Anak's generation may have been one of relative stability, a period when the city grew, the population increased, and the lineage became firmly rooted in the hill country of Canaan. His sons would later face the challenge of defending that inheritance against the advancing Israelites, but Anak himself may have lived and died before that confrontation became inevitable. The three sons of Anak, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, are the only descendants explicitly named in the biblical text, raising the question of whether Anak had other children whose names were not preserved. The consistent repetition of these three names across Joshua, Judges, and Numbers suggests that they were the primary heirs, the ones who inherited leadership or who controlled the key territories around Hebron. Whether they ruled jointly, divided the region among themselves, or succeeded one another over time is not specified. What is clear is that by the time the Israelite spies entered the land, these three were recognized as the dominant figures among the Anakim, and their father's name had become the designation for the entire people. The etymology of the three sons' names has been examined for clues about their roles or characteristics. Sheshai's name may derive from a root meaning whitish or noble, though its exact meaning remains uncertain. Ahiman has been interpreted as brother of a gift, or my brother is a gift, a name that suggests family solidarity or valued lineage. Talmai means furrowed or bold, possibly indicating a warrior or someone associated with agriculture and land. None of these names carry the overt connotations of size or strength that later tradition might expect from giants, suggesting that the Anakim, despite their stature, understood themselves in terms familiar to other ancient Near Eastern peoples: lineage, land, and family. Anak's position between his father Arba and his three sons creates a genealogical structure that mirrors other biblical patterns. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob form a three-generation arc that establishes the identity of Israel. Similarly, Arba, Anak, and the three sons form a three-generation structure that defines the Anakim. The middle generation in such structures often receives less narrative attention, serving primarily to link the founder to the fulfillment. Isaac's life, though recounted, is less dramatic than Abraham's or Jacob's, and his primary role is to receive the promise and pass it forward. Anak functions similarly. He inherits Arba's legacy and transmits it to the sons who will face Israel's challenge. The fact that the biblical writers preserved Anak's name at all, given the absence of stories about him, suggests that his identity was too well known in Israelite tradition to be omitted. The spies who returned from Canaan did not speak of the sons of Arba or the descendants of the Rephaim, but specifically of the sons of Anak, indicating that Anak's name was the one by which these giants were recognized in common speech. This widespread recognition implies that Anak's role as forefather was not a minor detail, but a central element of how the Anakim understood and presented themselves. Some later Jewish traditions attempted to fill the narrative gap by attributing legendary feats to Anak, though these embellishments do not appear in the canonical text. Rabbinic sources occasionally depict him as a warrior of immense strength or as a figure who resisted divine judgment, but such accounts reflect the tendency of later interpreters to expand on biblical silence rather than evidence of ancient tradition. The biblical writers themselves seemed content to let Anak remain what he was: a name, a father, a link in a chain. The collective designation Anakim as sons of Anak or people of Anak parallels other biblical uses of ancestral names to define ethnic or tribal groups. The Moabites are called sons of Moab, the Ammonites sons of Ammon, and the Edomites trace their identity to Esau, also called Edom. In each case, the personal name of the ancestor becomes the national identity of the descendants. Anak functions in precisely this way for the Anakim. He is the eponymous ancestor, the one whose name encapsulates the people. Whether this naming pattern reflects literal descent from a single individual or a symbolic attachment to a legendary founder is a question the biblical text does not resolve. The connection between Anak and the Nephilim, made explicit in Numbers 13:33, casts his lineage in a darker light. The spies claim that the descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim, links the Anakim directly to the pre-flood giants, suggesting either a genealogical continuity or a theological comparison. If understood literally, this statement implies that Anak himself was a descendant of those whose existence had prompted divine judgment, making him part of a lineage that should have been erased by the flood. If understood metaphorically, it means that Anak's descendants were so formidable that they reminded the spies of the ancient giants whose stories had been passed down through generations. Either way, the association places Anak at the center of a theological problem. How could a people connected to the Nephilim still exist in the land promised to Abraham? This question would haunt Israel through the wilderness years and into the conquest. The existence of the Anakim, traced back through Anak to Arba and possibly beyond, represented not merely a military challenge but a confrontation with a past that was supposed to have been judged and buried. Anak's role as forefather meant that every encounter with the Anakim was, in a sense, an encounter with him, his legacy, his line, his unrecorded life that had somehow produced a people capable of terrifying an entire generation of Israelites. The brevity with which Anak is mentioned in the biblical text stands as a reminder that not all significant figures receive detailed narratives. His importance lay not in dramatic action, but in quiet transmission, the passing of identity and stature from one generation to the next. He was the father who became a forefather, the man who became a name, the individual whose existence mattered primarily because of what followed from it. In that sense, his story is less about what he did than about what he enabled, the continuation of a lineage that would stand, for a time, as the boundary between Israel and the fulfillment of their promise. When Caleb finally drove out the 3 sons of Anak from Hebron, he was not merely defeating 3 warriors or displacing 3 chiefs. He was severing a genealogical line that stretched back through Anak to Arba, a line that had defined the Anakim for generations. Anak himself was long dead, but his legacy lived on in the sons who bore his name and in the people who called themselves his descendants. The conquest of Hebron was, in this sense, the erasure of a forefather's legacy, the end of a lineage that had survived everything, except the promise made to Abraham centuries earlier in the very city where Anak's descendants had made their stronghold. The 3 names appear together in every passage that mentions them, always in the same order: Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. This consistency across Numbers, Joshua, and Judges suggests that the Israelite memory preserved them not as generic representatives of the Anakim, but as specific individuals whose identities were well known. They were the sons of Anak dwelling in Hebron when the 12 spies entered Canaan, and their presence in that city became the focal point of a report that would alter the course of an entire generation. Numbers 13:22 records that the spies came to Hebron where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. The detail is precise, naming both the location and the inhabitants, as if to emphasize that this was not rumor or legend but observed reality. The etymology of their names has been examined by scholars seeking to understand their origins and possible cultural affiliations. Ahiman appears to be Semitic, potentially meaning brother of fortune, or my brother is a gift, a name that suggests familial bonds or valued lineage. Sheshai's name has been linked to possible Hurrian origins, though its exact meaning remains uncertain. Talmai similarly carries Hurrian linguistic markers, with some interpreters suggesting it means furrowed, or may relate to a title of nobility. The presence of non-Semitic names among the Anakim has led some scholars to propose that these giants were not ethnically Canaanite, but part of a broader Indo-European migration into the region during the 2nd millennium BCE. Yet the biblical text itself makes no comment on their linguistic or ethnic background, treating them simply as sons of Anak and rulers of Hebron. What distinguished these 3 from other inhabitants of Canaan was not merely their lineage, but their physical presence. The reconnaissance mission in Numbers 13 was designed to assess the land's fertility, fortifications, and inhabitants. The spies returned with evidence of abundance, a cluster of grapes so large it required 2 men to carry it on a pole, but their report focused as much on the people as on the produce. They described men of great size and specifically identified the Nephilim. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim, dwelling in the land. The comparison to the pre-flood giants was not made lightly. It reflected a perception that these were not ordinary adversaries but beings whose stature defied normal human proportion. The climax of the spies' testimony came in their self-assessment. We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers, and we look the same to them. This phrase captures not only the physical disparity but the psychological impact of encountering Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. The spies did not merely observe that the sons of Anak were tall, they experienced their own diminishment in the presence of these figures. The comparison to grasshoppers suggests a scale of difference so extreme that it altered their sense of self, transforming trained men into something insignificant and vulnerable. Whether the sons of Anak actually perceived the Israelites this way, or whether this was the spies' projection of their own fear, the text does not clarify. What matters is that the encounter left the spies convinced that conquest was impossible. 10 of the 12 spies concluded their report with a declaration of defeat before battle. We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we. The phrase "stronger than we" was not merely a military assessment but an existential judgment, a conclusion that the gap between Israel and the inhabitants of the land, particularly the sons of Anak, was unbridgeable by human means. Only Caleb and Joshua dissented, insisting that the land could be taken because the Lord was with them. Yet their voices were drowned out by the terror that spread through the camp once the majority report was heard. The people wept through the night, complained against Moses and Aaron, and even proposed choosing a new leader to take them back to Egypt. The consequences of that report, and the fear inspired specifically by Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, were immediate and severe. God decreed that the entire generation that had come out of Egypt, except for Caleb and Joshua, would die in the wilderness. For 40 years, Israel would wander until the last of those who had doubted perished, and only then would their children be allowed to enter the promised land. The three sons of Anak, by simply existing in Hebron, became the catalyst for the longest delay in Israel's history. They did not march out to meet the spies in battle. They did not issue threats or display weapons. Their presence alone was enough to paralyze an entire nation. The biblical text does not describe the physical appearance of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai in detail, leaving the reader to imagine what the spies saw. No measurements are given, no features detailed, no comparisons made beyond the grass. Opera metaphor. This restraint contrasts with the description of Og, king of Bashan, whose bed is measured at 9 cubits long, providing a concrete reference point for his size. The absence of such specifics regarding the sons of Anak suggests that their impact was more psychological than purely physical, or that their appearance was so well known in Israelite tradition that no elaboration was necessary. They were the sons of Anak. That designation alone carried sufficient weight. The location of their dwelling in Hebron adds another layer of significance to their role. Hebron was not a remote outpost but a central city in the hill country, elevated and fortified, a natural stronghold. It was also the city where Abraham had purchased the cave of Machpelah and where the patriarchs were buried. The land promised to Abraham's descendants was, at the time of the spies' visit, controlled by the very figures whose presence made that promise seem impossible to fulfill. Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai ruled in the shadow of the patriarchs' tombs, unaware or unconcerned that their occupation of the city had been noted in a divine covenant centuries earlier. The fact that the spies went specifically to Hebron is mentioned explicitly in Numbers 13:22, indicating that the city was a deliberate target of the reconnaissance. Whether this was because of its strategic importance, its association with the patriarchs, or its reputation as a center of Anakim power, the text does not say. What is clear is that the encounter there became the defining moment of the mission. The spies saw other cities, other peoples, and reported on fortifications throughout the land, but it was the sons of Anak in Hebron who dominated their final testimony. The sight of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai reduced everything else the spies had observed to secondary importance. The 40 years that followed the spies' report transformed Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai from immediate obstacles into legendary figures. An entire generation grew up hearing the story of how their parents had seen the sons of Anak and lost courage. Children born in the wilderness learned the names of the 3 giants who ruled Hebron as part of the narrative of why they wandered, why their fathers and mothers would not enter the land. The sons of Anak became symbols, not merely of physical strength, but of the fear that stands between promise and fulfillment. Their existence was the proof offered by those who doubted that God's covenant could be realized in the face of earthly obstacles. Yet during those 40 years, the biblical text records nothing of what happened in Hebron itself. Whether Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai continued to rule, whether they aged or were succeeded by their own sons, whether they fortified the city further or lived in peace, none of this is narrated. The silence creates a strange temporal gap in which the giants remain frozen in the moment the spies saw them, while an entire generation of Israelites dies in the wilderness. By the time Joshua leads the next generation across the Jordan, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai are mentioned again, but now in the context of their removal. The conquest narratives in Joshua introduce a shift in tone regarding the sons of Anak. Where Numbers 13 presented them as insurmountable obstacles, Joshua 15 and Judges 1 describe their defeat matter-of-factly. Joshua 15:14 states simply, "Caleb drove out from there the three sons of Anak, Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai." The verse offers no description of the battle, no account of how the confrontation unfolded, no commentary on the difficulty of the task. The three names that had once paralyzed an entire nation are listed and then dismissed in a single sentence. What had seemed impossible to the previous generation is recorded as accomplished fact, almost as if the fear had been more formidable than the giants themselves. Judges 1:10 provides additional detail, noting that Judah went against the Canaanites who lived in Hebron. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Arba, and they defeated Sheshai and Ahiman and Talmai. The repetition of the three names confirms that these were the same individuals, or at least figures bearing the same names and identities, whom the spies had encountered decades earlier. The phrase "they defeated" uses a Hebrew verb that can mean struck down or killed, suggesting that the sons of Anak did not merely flee but were eliminated. Their removal was final, not temporary. Caleb's role in this victory is emphasized in both Joshua and Judges. Joshua 14 records Caleb's request for Hebron as his inheritance, specifically mentioning that he was one of the two spies who had brought back a good report 40 years earlier. His words to Joshua recall the reconnaissance mission. "I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought him word again as it was in my heart." Caleb had seen Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai when the others saw them, yet he had not been paralyzed by their presence. Now, at 85 years old, he asks for the very territory that had once symbolized impossibility. His confidence is explicit. "It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out just as the Lord said." The phrase "drive them out" refers specifically to the sons of Anak, who still occupied Hebron at the time of Caleb's request. Joshua grants the inheritance, and Caleb fulfills his own prophecy, removing the three giants whose fathers had been the excuse for an entire generation's faithlessness. The text treats this as the completion of something that should have happened 40 years earlier, a delayed obedience finally enacted by the one man who had never doubted. The manner of their defeat is not detailed, leaving interpreters to speculate on whether Caleb fought alone, led a force from the tribe of Judah, or relied on divine intervention. The biblical writers seem deliberately uninterested in the mechanics of the battle, as if the point was not how the giants were defeated, but that they were defeated at all. The narrative priority is theological rather than military. Faith overcame fear, promise triumphed over obstacle, and the sons of Anak, for all their legendary stature, were mortal and could be displaced. The removal of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai from Hebron also marks the effective end of the Anakim as a distinct people in the biblical narrative. Joshua 11:21-22 notes that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the hill country, from Hebron, Debir, Anab, and all the hill country of Judah and Israel, destroying them utterly with their cities. The text adds that none of the Anakim were left in the land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod did some remain. This summary indicates that the defeat of the three sons of Anak in Hebron was part of a broader campaign that dismantled the Anakim strongholds throughout the region. The giants who had once seemed unconquerable were systematically eliminated, their cities taken, their lineages ended. The survival of remnants in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod provides a thread that will connect the Anakim to later narratives. Goliath, the giant from Gath who will face David centuries later, may represent the last echo of the Anakim lineage, a descendant of those who fled westward when Caleb drove out Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai. If so, the story that began with the sons of Anak in Hebron ends with another giant falling before an Israelite who trusted God despite the disparity in size. The pattern holds. The giants are formidable, their stature real, but they are not invincible. The psychological transformation required to move from the fear expressed in Numbers 13 to the victory recorded in Joshua 15 is perhaps the most significant aspect of the sons of Anak's story. The spies who saw Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai in their prime described themselves as grasshoppers, utterly incapable of confronting such adversaries. The generation that believed that report died in the wilderness, their bones marking the path of their wandering. But their children, raised in a wilderness that offered no security except God's daily provision, developed a different perspective. When they finally crossed the Jordan and approached Hebron, they did not see the sons of Anak as proof that the promise was impossible, but as the last obstacle to its fulfillment. Caleb's personal involvement in their defeat carries symbolic weight beyond the military outcome. He had been the one who, 40 years earlier, tried to silence the people's fear by declaring, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." His fellow spies had contradicted him, and the people had sided with the majority. Now, having outlived every one of those who doubted, Caleb returns to finish what should have been done a generation earlier. The defeat of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai by the hand of Caleb vindicates his original faith and demonstrates that the obstacle was never as insurmountable as fear had made it seem. The three sons of Anak, then, function in the biblical narrative as a test case for faith. Their stature was real, their presence formidable, their reputation terrifying. They were not fabrications or exaggerations designed to justify Israel's failure. They were actual inhabitants of Hebron whose size was sufficient to inspire genuine fear. Yet the outcome of their story demonstrates that physical reality, however imposing, is not the final word. The generation that saw only the giants died without entering the land. The generation that saw the giants as part of the promise, obstacles to be removed rather than reasons to retreat, inherited what had been sworn to their ancestors. After their removal, Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai disappear from the biblical record entirely. No monuments mark their graves, no songs preserve their deeds, no. Genealogies trace their descendants beyond the note that some Anakim survived in Philistine territory. They existed in the text primarily as obstacles, and once removed, the narrative moves on. Their legacy is preserved only in the memory of the fear they inspired and the faith required to overcome it. The sons who became legends did so not through conquest or glory, but through being the giants that Israel learned to defeat. The command came from the Lord to Moses while Israel was encamped at Kadesh Barnea, an oasis in the wilderness of Paran at the southern edge of the Promised Land. Numbers 13 opens with the divine directive, "Send men to spy out the land of Canaan, which I am giving to the people of Israel." The phrasing carries a tension that will become central to the entire episode. The land is described as already given, yet it must still be surveyed, assessed, and eventually taken. The reconnaissance was not meant to determine whether conquest was possible, but to gather information about what God had already promised. The mission's purpose was observation, not evaluation of divine capability. Moses selected one leader from each of the 12 tribes, men whose status ensured that their testimony would carry weight with the people. The list of names is preserved in Numbers 13, 4-15. Shammua son of Zachar from Reuben, Shaphat son of Hori from Simeon, Caleb son of Jephunneh from Judah, Igal son of Joseph from Issachar, Hoshea son of Nun from Ephraim, whom Moses renamed Joshua, and 7 others representing the remaining tribes. These were not young scouts or expendable soldiers, but tribal heads, men whose word would be believed and whose judgment would influence the entire congregation. The selection process itself indicated the seriousness of the mission and the expectation that their report would shape Israel's immediate future. The instructions Moses gave them were specific and comprehensive. They were to go through the Negev into the hill country and observe the nature of the land itself, whether good or bad, rich or poor, forested or barren. They were to assess the people living there, whether strong or weak, few or many. They were to examine the cities, whether open or fortified, whether the inhabitants dwelt in camps or strongholds. And they were to bring back samples of the land's produce, for it was the season when grapes were beginning to ripen. The mission was designed to provide a complete intelligence report, encompassing military, agricultural, and demographic data. For 40 days, the 12 men traveled through the land, moving northward from the wilderness of Zin to Rahab near Lebo-Hamath, covering a distance that spanned nearly the entire length of Canaan. They passed through territories that would later become the inheritances of Judah, Ephraim, Manasseh, and the northern tribes. The route took them through valleys and highlands, past fortified cities and agricultural regions, giving them a comprehensive view of what awaited Israel. The text notes the thoroughness of their survey without providing a daily itinerary, leaving the impression that they moved systematically through the land, observing without engaging, gathering information without drawing attention to themselves. At some point during their journey, they came to Hebron. Numbers 13:22 records the moment with precision. They went up into the Negev and came to Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the descendants of Anak, were living. The text adds a parenthetical note. Now Hebron had been built 7 years before Zoan in Egypt. This chronological reference ties Hebron to the deep past, situating it as one of the most ancient cities in the region, a place with roots stretching back centuries before Israel's time in Egypt. The spies were not entering a frontier settlement, but a city with history, permanence, and the weight of generations behind it. The encounter with the sons of Anak in Hebron is not described in detail within Numbers 13:22, yet the mention of their presence at this specific location becomes the pivot on which the entire mission turns. The spies saw Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, and whatever impression that encounter made, it dominated their subsequent report. The text does not say whether the giants were walking through the streets, standing guard at the gates, or simply visible in the distance, but the fact that the spies identified them by name suggests either that they asked inhabitants about them, or that the sons of Anak were figures of such prominence that their identities were unmistakable. From Hebron, the spies continued to the valley of Eshcol, a fertile region where they cut down a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes so large that it required 2 men to carry it on a pole between them. They also gathered pomegranates and figs, evidence of the land's abundance. The image of 2 men bearing a single grape cluster on a pole would become one of the most enduring visual symbols of the reconnaissance, a testament to the fertility God had promised. The valley itself was named Eshcol, meaning cluster, because of what the Israelites cut down there, a designation that preserved the memory of that moment. After 40 days, the 12 spies returned to Kadesh Barnea, where Moses, Aaron, and the entire congregation waited for their report. They came back bearing the fruit of the land, physical proof that the report's abundance were not exaggerated. The grapes, pomegranates, and figs were displayed before the assembly, tangible evidence that the land did indeed flow with milk and honey, just as God had said. For a moment, the mission appeared successful. The spies had surveyed the land, confirmed its fertility, and returned with samples that vindicated the divine promise. But when they began to speak, the tone shifted. Numbers 13:27-28 records their words. "We came to the land to which you sent us. It flows with milk and honey, and this is its fruit. However, the people who dwell in the land are strong, and the cities are fortified and very large." The word, however, marks the turning point, the transition from affirmation to objection. What followed was a catalog of obstacles. The Amalekites in the Negev, the Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites in the hill country, the Canaanites by the sea and along the Jordan. And then the final crushing detail. "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The mention of the Nephilim was not a casual observation, but the climax of the report, the reason why all the other obstacles seemed insurmountable. The spies had seen fortified cities before, encountered strong peoples in other regions, noted the presence of various Canaanite tribes, yet none of those observations paralyzed them the way the sight of the sons of Anak did. The comparison to grasshoppers was not hyperbole designed to deceive, but a genuine reflection of how the spies experienced their own diminishment in the presence of these giants. They had walked through the land for 40 days, seen its fertility and its defenses, but it was Hebron, where Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai dwelt, that undid their confidence. Caleb's response was immediate and forceful. Numbers 13:30 records that he quieted the people before Moses and said, "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." His words cut directly against the fear that had begun to spread through the assembly, offering a counter-narrative in which the obstacles were acknowledged but not deemed insurmountable. Caleb had seen the same cities, the same peoples, the same sons of Anak that the other spies had seen, yet he reached a fundamentally different conclusion. His confidence was not based on denial of reality, but on a different assessment of whose strength mattered more, Israel's or God's. But the other 10 spies would not be silenced. They doubled down on their testimony, explicitly contradicting Caleb. "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." The phrase "stronger than we" placed the evaluation entirely on human terms, a calculation of relative military strength that left no room for divine intervention. What followed was even more damaging. "The land, through which we have gone to spy it out, is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height." The metaphor of a land that devours suggests a place so hostile, so dangerous, that even its own inhabitants could not thrive there, though the evidence of the fruit they had brought back contradicted this claim. The 10 spies then elaborated on what they had seen in Hebron, and their description became the definitive statement that would haunt Israel for a generation. "And there we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim, and we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." The repetition of Nephilim twice in a single sentence underscored the significance of the connection. The spies were not merely reporting tall men, but linking the sons of Anak directly to the pre-flood giants whose existence had once necessitated divine judgment. Whether this connection was genealogical fact or fearful association, the spies presented it as verified reality. The grasshopper metaphor carried a double weight. First, it described the spies' internal perception. "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers," indicating that their sense of self-worth and capability had collapsed in the presence of the Anakim. Second, it projected that diminishment outward, "and so we seemed to them," suggesting that the sons of Anak viewed the Israelites with the same contempt that a human might view an insect. Whether the spies had actually heard the Anakim express such views, or whether this was purely psychological projection, the text does not clarify. What mattered was that the encounter had not only revealed the giant's size, but had redefined the spies' understanding of their own identity. The congregation's reaction was swift and catastrophic. Numbers 14:1 records that all the congregation raised a loud cry, and the people wept that night. The weeping was not quiet mourning but communal lamentation, a collective expression of despair that spread through the entire camp. By morning, the grief had turned to rebellion. The people complained against Moses and Aaron, saying, "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become a prey. Would it not be better for us to go back to Egypt?" The logic of their complaint revealed how thoroughly the report of the sons of Anak had reshaped their perception of God's promise. They could no longer see the land as a gift, but only as a trap, a place where they would die by the sword and their families would be enslaved. The God who had delivered them from Egypt, parted the Red Sea, provided manna and water in the wilderness, was now recast as one leading them to slaughter. The presence of Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai in Hebron had become, in their minds, proof that the promise was impossible, that faith was futile, and that survival required retreat. The rebellion escalated quickly. Numbers 14:4 records that the people said to one another, "Let us choose a leader and go back to Egypt." This was not merely complaint but insurrection, a proposal to replace Moses and reverse the entire Exodus. The covenant at Sinai, the journey through the wilderness, the pillar of cloud and fire, all of it was now, in their estimation, a mistake that needed to be undone. The fear inspired by the sons of Anak had metastasized into a rejection of divine leadership itself. Moses and Aaron fell on their faces before the assembly, a gesture of supplication and grief. Joshua and Caleb tore their clothes, a sign of mourning and distress, and addressed the congregation directly. Their words, recorded in Numbers 14:7-9, attempted to redirect attention from the obstacles to the promise. "The land which we pass through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land. If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey. Only do not rebel against the Lord, and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." Joshua and Caleb's argument was theological rather than military. They did not deny the strength of the inhabitants or the size of the sons of Anak. Instead, they reframed the question. The issue was not Israel's ability to defeat giants, but God's willingness to fulfill his promise. The phrase, "they are bread for us," suggested that the Canaanites, however formidable they appeared, would be consumed as easily as food if the Lord fought for Israel. The claim that their protection is removed from them implied that whatever spiritual or military strength the inhabitants once possessed had already been withdrawn by divine decree. But the congregation would not hear them. Numbers 14:10 records that all the congregation said to stone them with stones. The rebellion had reached the point of violence, with Joshua and Caleb, the only two spies who maintained faith in the promise, now marked for execution. At that moment, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all the people of Israel, a visible manifestation of divine presence that interrupted the mob before they could act. What followed was a divine pronouncement of judgment. God's words to Moses, recorded in Numbers 14:11-12, expressed both frustration and a proposed solution. "How long will this people despise me? And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." The proposal to start over with Moses alone echoed an earlier moment at Sinai after the golden calf, but now the context was different. The rejection was not of abstract commandments but of a tangible promise, and the obstacle that justified the rejection was the sons of Anak in Hebron. Moses interceded, appealing not to Israel's worthiness but to God's reputation among the nations. His argument, recorded in Numbers 14:13-19, warned that if God destroyed Israel now, the Egyptians and Canaanites would interpret it as divine weakness, a failure to bring the people into the promised land. Moses quoted back to God his own self-description from Exodus 34. The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression. The intercession was successful in averting total destruction, but judgment still came. God's decree was precise and generational. Those 20 years old and above, who had seen his glory and his signs yet tested him 10 times and not obeyed his voice, would not see the land he had sworn to their fathers. Their corpses would fall in the wilderness over the course of 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had surveyed the land. Only Caleb and Joshua, the two who had maintained faith, would enter. The children whom the people had feared would become prey. Why do the Canaanites would instead inherit the promise their parents rejected? The reconnaissance that was meant to prepare Israel for conquest had instead become the reason for the longest delay in their history, and at the center of that delay stood 3 names: Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai, the sons of Anak dwelling in Hebron. The 12 men did not return in secret. They came back to Kadesh in full view of the camp, carrying with them the fruit of the land and the weight of what they had seen. The congregation gathered, drawn by expectation and weariness, for their years in the wilderness had been sustained by a promise that would now, they believed, take on visible form. Before any words were spoken, the great cluster of grapes, the pomegranates, and the figs were displayed as tangible proof that the land ahead was not barren but rich, a place where hunger would at last cease. Their initial words did not contradict this hope. The 10 who would soon darken the camp began with affirmation. The land to which they had been sent truly flowed with milk and honey, and the fruit they carried was evidence. For a moment, the report aligned perfectly with the divine promise. What God had spoken in Egypt and at Sinai appeared confirmed by the witness of the eyes. Yet their testimony did not end there. A single word turned affirmation into dread. However, with that pivot, the land ceased to be simply a gift and became a threat. They spoke first of the people. The inhabitants were strong, they said, and the cities were fortified and very large. Walls rose where Israel had tents, gates where Israel had open camp, battlements where Israel had only memory of bondage and wandering. The Amalekites occupied the Negev. The Hittites, Jebusites, and Amorites held the hill country, and the Canaanites controlled the sea coast and the Jordan Valley. Each name carried with it a reputation, some as traders, some as warriors, all as established peoples whose roots in the land seemed older and deeper than Israel's own fragile identity. Yet these descriptions, troubling as they were, did not break the camp. Israel had seen strong nations before, Egypt with its chariots, Amalek with its sudden attack in the wilderness. The decisive moment came when the 10 turned from listing nations to naming a lineage. There we saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. In that single sentence, the land of Canaan was linked back to the age before the flood, to stories whispered around campfires about giants whose existence had once drawn judgment from heaven. The sons of Anak in Hebron were no longer merely tall men. They were framed as heirs of a primordial corruption. The language they used to describe themselves in comparison revealed how deeply that association had entered their hearts. "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers," they said, "and so we seem to them." The word chosen did not simply convey smallness but insignificance, creatures easily crushed underfoot, without voice or weight in the presence of towering figures. This was more than a military assessment. It was a confession of identity collapse. They no longer saw themselves as the people brought out of Egypt with a mighty hand, but as insects in a land that devours its inhabitants. The phrase "a land that devours its inhabitants" added another layer to the terror they spread. On one level, it may have referred to constant warfare, to a landscape where city fought city and survival demanded unending vigilance. On another, it suggested a place almost alive in hostility, a land whose very character consumed those who tried to dwell there. The abundance of its fruit and the strength of its peoples were recast not as blessings, but as signs of a place too dangerous to inhabit. The gift had become a snare in their telling. Caleb, hearing the direction their words had taken, tried to intervene. He quieted the people before Moses and spoke with the simplicity of one who refused to let what he had seen overshadow what he had heard from God. "Let us go up at once and occupy it, for we are well able to overcome it." He did not deny the presence of fortified cities or giants. He denied only the conclusion that these realities made obedience impossible. For a brief moment, another path appeared, a way in which fear would not be allowed to interpret the promise. The 10, however, would not yield the narrative. They brought to the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out. The text distinguishes between what they had seen and the way they framed it. The report was bad, not because the observations were fabricated, but because the interpretation twisted the truth into despair. They amplified danger, compressed hope, and presented their conclusion as unavoidable. "We are not able to go up against the people, for they are stronger than we." In that sentence, the promise given by God was weighed against visible strength and found wanting. What made their testimony so powerful was not only its content but its source. These were leaders of tribes, men chosen precisely because their word carried authority. The people had no independent access to the land. They had not seen Hebron, its walls, or the sons of Anak with their own eyes. All they possessed were memories of slavery, experiences of wilderness, and the words now spoken by those they trusted to speak for them. When the 10 declared that the land devours its inhabitants and that its people were of great height, the congregation received those words as settled reality. Fear, once introduced, moved quickly. It spread not as argument but as atmosphere, seeping into tents and conversations, turning questions into certainties. The people did not debate the report, they wept. The night became a single cry rising from the camp, as the image of giants in Hebron, of fortified cities, of a devouring land, replayed itself in their minds. Caleb's dissent, though spoken with conviction, was a single voice against 10, and the narrative that took root was not his. By morning, fear had settled into resolve, not the resolve to go forward but to turn back. By the next day, grief had hardened into accusation. The people gathered before Moses and Aaron with words that amounted to a reversal of everything the Exodus had represented. "Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or would that we had died in this wilderness." Death in bondage now seemed preferable to freedom that required facing the sons of Anak in Hebron. The divine deliverance, the crossing of the Red Sea, the provision of manna, all of it was recast as a cruel prelude to slaughter. "Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword?" they demanded. The God who had declared himself their deliverer was now accused of orchestrating their destruction. Their fear extended beyond themselves to their families. "Our wives and our little ones will become plunder," they said, imagining a future where the sons of Anak descended from Hebron to enslave those who survived. The promise of inheritance had become, in their telling, a certainty of captivity. What the spies had seen in 40 days of reconnaissance had undone what God had demonstrated through years of miracles. The visible giants outweighed the invisible presence that had led them with cloud and fire. The final step came quickly. "Let us choose a leader and return to Egypt," they said to one another. This was no longer complaint but conspiracy, a proposal to replace Moses and reverse the direction of their journey. The covenant made at Sinai, the laws received, the tabernacle constructed, all would be abandoned in favor of a return to the only life they remembered before the wilderness. Egypt, where they had cried out under the lash, now represented safety compared to a land defended by descendants of the Nephilim. Moses and Aaron responded not with argument but with prostration. They fell on their faces before the entire assembly, a gesture of grief and intercession that acknowledged the severity of what was unfolding. Joshua and Caleb took a different approach. They tore their clothes, the ancient sign of mourning, and addressed the congregation directly with words meant to reframe everything the 10 spies had said. "The land which we passed through to spy it out is an exceedingly good land," they declared. They did not deny the fortifications or the presence of the Anakim, but insisted these were not determinative. Their appeal was theological, not tactical. "If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land that flows with milk and honey," Joshua and Caleb said. The issue in their telling was not Israel's strength relative to the sons of Anak, but God's faithfulness to his promise. "Only do not rebel against the Lord," they warned, "and do not fear the people of the land, for they are bread for us. Their protection is removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them." The metaphor was striking. The Canaanites, including the giants, would be consumed as easily as Israel ate the manna God provided. But the congregation had already made their decision. Numbers 14:10 records that all the congregation said to stone them with stones. Joshua and Caleb, the two who refused to let fear interpret reality, were now marked for execution. The proposal to return to Egypt required silencing the voices that insisted another path was possible. Before the stones could be gathered, however, the glory of the Lord appeared at the tent of meeting before all the people. The rebellion was interrupted not by human intervention, but by divine presence. What followed was a conversation between God and Moses that revealed the depth of the offense. "How long will this people despise me?" the Lord said to Moses. "And how long will they not believe in me, in spite of all the signs that I have done among them?" The question was not rhetorical but expressed genuine frustration with a people who had witnessed plagues in Egypt, deliverance at the sea, water from rock, bread from heaven, and still concluded that Hebron's giants proved God incapable of fulfilling his word. The proposal came swiftly. "I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they." Moses interceded, not by defending Israel's faithfulness but by appealing to God's reputation among the nations. If the Egyptians and Canaanites heard that Israel had been destroyed in the wilderness, they would interpret it as divine weakness. Moses argued, a failure to complete what had been begun. He quoted back to God the self-description given at Sinai. "The Lord is slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, forgiving iniquity and transgression." The intercession succeeded in averting total annihilation, but judgment still fell. The decree was generational and precise. Every person 20 years old and above who had seen God's glory and his signs yet tested him, and not obeyed, would die in the wilderness. Their corpses would fall over the course of 40 years, 1 year for each day the spies had surveyed the land. Only Caleb and Joshua, the two who had maintained faith despite what they saw in Hebron, would live to enter. The children whom the people had feared would become plunder would instead inherit what their parents refused. The report that paralyzed a nation had become the reason for its extended exile. The 10 spies who brought the bad report did not live to see the wilderness wandering begin. Numbers 14:37 records that they died by plague before the Lord. The judgment was immediate, a visible demonstration that the sentence pronounced on the congregation would be fulfilled. Joshua and Caleb alone of the 12 remained alive, their survival a testimony to the difference between observation and interpretation, between seeing giants and seeing God. The people's response to the judgment revealed how thoroughly fear had distorted their perception. Upon hearing they would not enter the land, they mourned and then reversed course again. "We have sinned," they declared. "We will go up to the place that the Lord has promised." But Moses warned them that the moment had passed. "Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you, lest you be struck down before your enemies." They went anyway, without the Ark of the Covenant, without Moses, and without divine presence. The Amalekites and Canaanites came down from the hill country and defeated them, chasing them as far as Hormah. The report of the 10 spies had accomplished what no external enemy had managed. It turned Israel against itself, against Moses, and ultimately against the promise that had sustained them since Egypt. The sons of Anak in Hebron never marched out to meet Israel in battle. They simply existed, and their existence was enough. Fear, once given a name and a location, became a narrative more powerful than miracle. The testimony of 10 men outweighed the testimony of the pillar of fire. And for 40 years, the wilderness became a graveyard where a generation died not by sword or famine, but by the refusal to believe that giants could fall. The decree fell at Kadesh like a closing gate. Those who had listened to the report of the 10, who had allowed the names of Anak's sons to define the future, heard words that turned their camp from a staging ground into a place of sentencing. The Lord declared that none of those who had seen his signs in Egypt and in the wilderness, and yet tested him and refused to heed his voice, would see the land he had sworn to give to their fathers. The promise itself remained unchanged. What changed was the generation permitted to receive it. The judgment was not a single blow, but a measured sentence stretched across time. For every day the spies had searched the land, 40 days, there would be a year of wandering. The number fixed the consequence directly to the reconnaissance, tying each circuit through the wilderness to that journey through Canaan, where the sons of Anak had been seen and misjudged. The land ahead, with Hebron at its heart, receded beyond a horizon that only their children would cross. Those counted in the census, 20 years old and upward, became the boundary of exclusion. Their corpses, the decree said, would fall in the wilderness, and the very children they feared would become prey would instead be shepherded into the inheritance they had refused. Daily life continued, tents raised and struck, manna gathered, disputes judged. But beneath every ordinary act lay the knowledge that the days were not steps toward promise, but the slow unfolding of a sentence. Time itself became an instrument of judgment. The wilderness, which had been a passage, became a dwelling place with no destination. Paths crossed and recrossed old routes. Water was found and lost and found again, yet the movement did not bring them closer to Hebron or to the cities they had once been shown from afar. Each burial mound became a reminder of the words spoken at Kadesh, each death another marker counting down years assigned to unbelief. The land they might have taken swiftly would now be reached only by those who had been children when the report was first heard. Yet even within the severity of the decree, a distinction remained. 2 names were set apart, Caleb son of Jephunneh and Joshua son of Nun. They were promised not only entrance into the land but specific inheritance. Caleb, who had stilled the people and urged them to go up at once, was told that the land he had trodden would be his and his descendants, because he had followed fully. Joshua, who had joined his voice to Caleb's in urging the people not to fear, was appointed as the one who would eventually lead the next generation in. In a camp under judgment, these 2 lives stood as living testimony that faith did not erase consequence, but it preserved promise. The Anakim, though they remained in their cities, became an unseen presence in the wilderness years. They did not appear in daily life, yet their memory hovered at the edge of every story told about why the people walked and did not arrive. Parents who had once wept at the report now told their children of giants in the hills, of fortified cities, of a night when the camp almost turned back to Egypt. The names Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai entered the vocabulary of warning, examples of what fear could make a people do, and of what it could cost them. In that long delay, the children grew into the ones for whom the promise was now intended. They learned the law at Sinai's shadow, saw the tabernacle razed and taken down, heard the blessings and curses read aloud. They buried fathers and mothers whose bones would never rest in the land sworn to Abraham. For them, the giants were not first-hand memory but inherited story, still formidable, still tall in the imagination, but no longer bound to their own fear in the same way. The 40 years that bleached bones in the wilderness also thinned the hold of that first report. The judgment, precise as it was, did not annul covenant. It delayed its human fulfillment. The oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob remained in force, yet its realization passed from one generation to the next. The Anakim thus became an instrument in a larger pattern. Through their presence, unbelief was exposed, a generation was weighed and found wanting, and another was prepared in the crucible of waiting. The longest delay in Israel's history traced its origin not to foreign armies or famine, but to a moment when what had been seen with the eyes overruled what had been heard from the mouth of God. The numbers themselves told the story of replacement. At Sinai, during the first census taken in the second year after the Exodus, 603,550 men of military age, 20 years old and upward, were counted. 40 years later, on the plains of Moab, a second census recorded 601,730 men in that same age range. The population had remained nearly constant, yet the people themselves had changed. The generation counted at Sinai had almost entirely perished, their places taken by sons who bore the same tribal names but Kar. Why different memories? Deuteronomy 2:14 marks the end point with stark precision. The time from our leaving Kadesh Barnea until we crossed the Wadi Zerd was 38 years, until the whole generation of warriors had perished from the camp, as the Lord had sworn to them. 38 years from Kadesh to Zerd meant that 2 of the 40 had already passed before that specific marker, but the text focuses on the completion, the moment when the last of those who had doubted finally died. The wilderness had done its work, and the decree spoken at Kadesh had been fulfilled. The death rate required to accomplish this generational turnover has been estimated by scholars attempting to understand the scale. If over 1 million adults aged 20 and above were under sentence, men, women, and Levites combined, then over the course of 40 years, roughly 70 to 80 people would have died each day. The wilderness became a slow-motion graveyard where burial was a daily occurrence, where parents disappeared one by one until the camp was populated almost entirely by those who had been children when the spies returned. The bones mentioned in the decree were not metaphor but accumulating reality. Yet daily life did not cease. Manna still fell each morning, water was still provided, clothes and sandals did not wear out according to Deuteronomy's later reflection. The 40 years were not simply punishment but also provision, a contradiction the text does not resolve but presents as simultaneous reality. God's anger had decreed death for those who doubted, yet his covenant faithfulness ensured that their children would not perish alongside them. The wilderness became both judgment and preservation, a place where one generation ended and another was sustained. The distinction between those under sentence and those who would inherit remained absolute. Numbers 32:13 later summarized the period. The Lord's anger burned against Israel, and he made them wander in the wilderness 40 years until the whole generation that had done evil in his sight was gone. The language left no ambiguity. The wandering continued until the last member of the condemned generation had died. Only then could movement toward Canaan resume in earnest. Caleb and Joshua, the exceptions to the sentence, aged alongside those who died but did not share their fate. By the time the 40 years concluded, Caleb was 85 years old, yet still vigorous enough to request the hill country where the Anakim dwelt as his inheritance. His survival was not merely biological but covenantal, a living demonstration that faith exercised at Kadesh had preserved life where doubt had brought death. Joshua, younger when the spies went out, grew into the role Moses would assign him, the one who would lead the next generation where the previous one had refused to go. The children who had been under 20 at Kadesh grew up hearing why they wandered. They learned the law in a landscape that offered no permanent settlement, understood covenant in a context where every promise pointed to a future their parents would not see. For them, the Anakim remained a reality they had not yet faced, giants whose names they knew from stories, but whose presence they would eventually have to confront themselves. The 40 years gave them time to become a generation, defined not by the fear of Kadesh, but by the discipline of wilderness obedience. The Anakim, meanwhile, remained in Hebron and the surrounding cities, untouched by the judgment unfolding in the wilderness. Whether Ahiman, Sheshai, and Talmai lived through all 40 years or were succeeded by their own descendants, the text does not say. From Israel's perspective, frozen in the consequences of that single report, the sons of Anak became almost timeless figures, obstacles that had once been encountered and would one day have to be faced again, but which existed in a kind of suspension while the wilderness did its work. They had not defeated Israel in battle. They had simply been seen, and that sight had been enough to cost a generation their inheritance. Toward the end of the 40 years, as the last of the condemned generation died, Moses addressed the people who would finally cross the Jordan. In Deuteronomy, he recounted the story of the spies, the rebellion, and the consequence, ensuring that the next generation understood what had cost their parents so dearly. He reminded them that the land remained the same, still flowing with milk and honey, still inhabited by fortified cities and strong peoples. The giants had not vanished simply because 40 years had passed. What had changed was the generation, and with it, the willingness to trust that divine promise outweighed visible obstacle. The sentence given at Kadesh was fulfilled with exactness. The text offers no record of any from the doubting generation entering Canaan except Caleb and Joshua. The bones that were promised to fall in the wilderness had fallen, scatter. Across paths Israel would never retrace. The delay, measured in years but experienced in deaths, had transformed the people, not by removing the challenge ahead, but by replacing those who saw giants as proof of impossibility with those who had been taught, through 40 years of daily dependence, that provision came from a source the eye could not measure. The longest delay in Israel's history ended not with the elimination of the Anakim, but with the elimination of the generation that had let the Anakim define what God could do. When the 40 years had passed and the last of the condemned generation had fallen, Israel stood once more on the threshold of the land that had waited through their wandering. The Jordan was crossed, Jericho and Ai had fallen, and the campaigns of Joshua had broken the spine of Canaanite resistance, though much remained to be possessed. In this setting, on the plains where inheritances were being measured and allotted, an old man stepped forward with a memory that reached back to Kadesh and to a hill country that had not yet been taken. Caleb, son of Jephunneh of the tribe of Judah, approached Joshua at Gilgal and spoke not as one asking for a favor, but as one invoking a promise. He reminded Joshua of the word the Lord had spoken through Moses concerning him at Kadesh Barnea, how, when others had melted the heart of the people, he had followed fully, bringing back a report that aligned with the promise rather than with the fear stirred by the sons of Anak. Moses had sworn on that day that the land on which Caleb's foot had trodden would be his inheritance, and that of his descendants forever, because he had kept to the path when others turned aside. 45 years had passed since that oath. Caleb now described himself as 85 years old, yet testified that he was as strong as in the day that Moses sent me, able still to go out and to come in for war. His words did not carry boastfulness so much as continuity, The faith that had enabled him to see Hebron through the lens of promise had not diminished with age. He asked, therefore, for the hill country of which the Lord had spoken, the very region where, all those years before, the spies had seen the fortified cities and the sons of Anak, and had declared the task impossible. He did not request an easy inheritance, a valley already subdued or a city weakened by previous campaigns. He named Hebron, knowing that it remained associated with the Anakim, and acknowledged that the cities there were great and fortified. Yet his request contained the same quiet resolve voiced at Kadesh. It may be that the Lord will be with me, and I shall drive them out as the Lord has said. The focus had not shifted in 4 decades. The calculation still rested not on his own strength, but on the presence that had been promised. Joshua blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb as an inheritance. The narrative compresses what must have been a hard campaign into a brief statement. Caleb went up against the inhabitants of Hebron and drove out Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, the sons of Anak. The names that had once been spoken in tremor at Kadesh were now recorded in the context of defeat. No description is given of the battle, no strategies, no numbers, no tactical advantages. The text is uninterested in the mechanics of how an 85-year-old man and those who fought with him overcame the giants. It is enough to say that the 3 were removed and their city taken. With their expulsion, Hebron passed from being Arba, the city named for the greatest man among the Anakim, to a city under the authority of one whose lineage traced not to giants, but to Judah. The burial place of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, once overshadowed by the presence of Anak's sons, now lay within the inheritance of a man who believed the promises given to those patriarchs when most of his peers did not. The shift was more than administrative. It marked a transfer of meaning. A place that had embodied impossibility in the memory of Israel's fathers became, in the experience of their sons, the proof that impossibility had been misjudged. The removal of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai also signaled the effective end of the Anakim as a distinct power in the hill country. Other texts summarize that Joshua cut off the Anakim from the mountains of Judah and Israel, leaving only remnants in the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. What had once been a concentrated stronghold in Hebron was now broken, its lineage scattered to coastal enclaves that would, in time, produce figures like Goliath, but would no longer define the central highlands. The giants had not ceased to exist, but their claim to the heart of the promised land had been revoked. For Caleb, Hebron was not merely a conquered city, but the vindication of a perspective held in isolation for many years. When others saw the sons of Anak and concluded that retreat was wisdom, he had seen the same figures and concluded that trust was obedience. The 40 years of delay had not altered the substance of what stood on those heights. Only the generation confronting them had changed. In returning to Hebron as an old man, Caleb was not discovering a new place, but finally taking hold of what he had discerned long before should have been taken. The narrative lingers briefly on the outcome, then moves forward, but the weight of what occurred at Hebron reverberates through later memory. Caleb's conquest did not simply alter a map, it resolved a 45-year tension between what had been promised and what had been feared. The same city that once stood as Exhibit A in the case against entering the land now became the personal inheritance of the man who had refused to let its giants dictate the terms of obedience. The hill country that had been used as proof that God's word was impractical became, in his old age, the clearest demonstration that the delay had exposed doubt, not divine weakness. The renaming of the city in the narrative subtly marks this transformation. The text recalls that Hebron was formerly called Arba, after Arba, the greatest man among the Anakim, but now speaks of it primarily by the name associated with Israel's story. The former designation is preserved as a memory, almost like a layer beneath the surface, present but no longer determinative. The city's identity has shifted from being bound to a giant forefather to being anchored in the burial place of the patriarchs and the faith of the one who claimed it in their name. The ground where giants once ruled is now defined by covenant and inheritance. Caleb's strategy, though not described in tactical detail, can be traced in its theological logic. He did not ask that the giants be removed before he arrived, nor that their strength be diminished over time. He requested the place as it was, trusting that the God who had preserved his life through 40 years of wandering would also sustain him in the hardest campaign of his old age. His words, "It may be that the Lord will be with me," do not express uncertainty about God's character, but humility about how that presence would be displayed. He did not demand a guarantee of visible victory in advance. He stepped toward Hebron because stepping toward Hebron was what obedience now required. The fall of Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai also completed, in a quiet way, the story that began with the reconnaissance of 12. 10 had testified that these sons of Anak were undefeatable, and on the basis of their conclusion, a generation had died without entering the land. Caleb's eventual triumph did not erase that history, but it revealed its true nature. The report that paralyzed the nation had not been a sober assessment of reality. It had been a misreading of reality under the pressure of fear. The giants were indeed formidable, but they were not beyond defeat. When the time finally came, they fell not to a new kind of warrior, but to the same man who had once insisted, against the majority, that they could fall. In the larger arc of the biblical narrative, the erasure of the Anakim from Hebron foreshadows the eventual fading of giant lineages altogether. Remnants remained in Philistine territory, and from them would arise individual figures who still embodied that old intimidation. Yet never again would giants define the central question of whether Israel could or should take what had been promised. After Caleb, the Anakim were no longer the measure of impossibility. They became, instead, part of the record of what had already been overcome. For the generations that followed, Hebron stood as a layered symbol. It was the city of Abraham's burial, the place where kings would later be anointed, and the site where giants once ruled but were driven out by an aged man whose strength lay less in sinew than in steadfastness. The line of Arba and Anak, once rooted there, was cut off from that ground. Their story did not vanish entirely from the earth, but in Hebron it ended. The land that had once magnified their stature now bore witness to their absence. Caleb disappears from the narrative after his inheritance is recorded, his life closing without fanfare. Yet his final act leaves behind a quiet legacy. He showed, by walking up into the same hill country that others had fled in their minds, that the true boundary of Israel's future had never been the height of its enemies, but the depth of its trust. The fall of the giants at Hebron was not merely the conclusion of a military campaign. It was the long-delayed correction of a misjudgment made at Kadesh, and the final proof that a lineage born in fear could indeed be brought to an end. The fall of Hebron did not erase the Anakim in a single stroke. The conquest accounts remember that after Caleb drove out the 3 sons of Anak from the hill country, remnants of their people withdrew westward, finding refuge among the Philistine cities of Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. The high places of Judah no longer sheltered them, but along the coastal plain and its fortified towns, the last embers of their lineage continued to smolder at the edges of Israel's future. Their cities changed, their neighbors changed, yet the memory of their stature remained. Joshua's summary speaks with deliberate finality. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the Israelites. Only in those Philistine cities did survivors remain. The statement draws a boundary line. Within the territory Israel had taken and settled, the age of Anak had ended. Beyond that line, however, in the strongholds of a rising sea people, fragments of the old giant bloodline persisted, absorbed into a culture that would soon become one of Israel's most persistent adversaries. The Anakim ceased to be lords of the central highlands and became hidden among the ranks of Philistine champions. Time passed, generations turned, judges rose and fell, tribes fought their local enemies, and the scattered Anakim in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod left no recorded deeds. They lived, married, trained for war, and disappeared into the anonymity of years. No text pauses to trace their genealogy from Arba or Anak. The line, if it continued, did so in silence. Yet when the narrative comes to the days of Saul and David, a familiar figure emerges from one of those very cities, a giant whose description awakens echoes of the old fear. Goliath of Gath is introduced not by lineage but by stature. His height is given in careful measurement, his armor weighed, his spear compared to a weaver's beam. The details are precise, almost ceremonial, as if the writer wished to present him as the distilled essence of giant kind. Towering frame, heavy bronze, massive weaponry. He steps forward from the Philistine ranks not only as an individual champion, but as the embodiment of everything that once made the sons of Anak seem unconquerable. The text does not need to call him Anakim. His presence alone makes the connection clear in the imagination of those who know the older stories. For 40 days, an echo of the 40 days the spies once spent in the land, Goliath issues his challenge morning and evening to the army of Israel. He demands a single combat that will decide the fate of two nations. Choose a man for yourselves and let him come down to me. The soldiers of Saul, like their ancestors at Kadesh, see the visible disparity and draw the same conclusion. They are dismayed and greatly afraid. No one moves. The fear that once turned a camp back to the wilderness now freezes an army on its own soil. Yet the generation facing Goliath is not the same as the one that heard of Hebron and turned away. These are the children of those who wandered, seasoned by years under judges and kings, and among them stands a young man whose perspective mirrors that of Caleb more than that of the 10 spies. David arrives not as a warrior but as a messenger, bringing provisions to his brothers. He hears the giant's words, sees the effect on Israel's ranks, and asks a question that reveals a different measure of reality. Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? Where others see height and armor, David sees defiance and covenant. Goliath is a giant, yes, but he is also a Philistine outside the covenant promises, standing against a people whose identity depends not on their size but on their God's faithfulness. The disparity between youth and warrior, between sling and spear, between shepherd's staff and bronze javelin, does not vanish in David's eyes. It simply does not outweigh the promise. The confrontation that follows is less about tactics than about what each figure represents in the long arc that began with Arba and Anak. David goes to meet Goliath armed with 5 smooth stones and a sling, rejecting Saul's armor as burdensome and unfamiliar. He speaks not as one minimizing the threat, but as one whose measure of victory is grounded elsewhere. You come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. The confrontation is framed from the beginning not as a contest of size or weaponry, but as a verdict on whose God stands behind the one who walks forward. The stone leaves David's sling and strikes Goliath in the forehead, the single unarmored point on a body clad in bronze. The giant falls forward onto the ground, and David, taking Goliath's own sword, cuts off his head. The army of the Philistines, whose confidence had rested on their champion, breaks and flees. Israel pursues, and the victory becomes total, not because they were stronger but because the figure who had paralyzed them for 40 days was suddenly, definitively, ended. Later texts confirm that Goliath was not the only giant among the Philistines. 2 Samuel 21 records additional battles with what it calls the descendants of the giants in Gath, including figures like Ishbi-benob, Saph, and a man with 6 fingers on each hand and 6 toes on each foot. David's men defeated them all, and the text notes that these 4 were descended from the giants in Gath. The language used, Rephaim, giants, descendants from Gath, links them back to the broader category of post-flood giant peoples, and likely to the Anakim who had found refuge there centuries earlier after Joshua's campaigns. Scholars examining the connections note that Goliath came from Gath, one of the 3 cities where Joshua left Anakim survivors. The logic is straightforward. Anakim remained in Gath after the conquest. Goliath was from Gath and exhibited the stature and characteristics associated with giants. Therefore, Goliath was likely a descendant of those Anakim remnants who had intermingled with the Philistine population over the centuries. The biblical writers do not make the genealogical claim explicit, but the geographic and descriptive details invite the connection. Some have proposed that Goliath may also have been connected to the Rephaim through another line, noting that 2 Samuel 21 describes him and his relatives as descendants of Rapha in Gath. Whether Rapha is a personal name or a designation for the Rephaim as a category, the association places Goliath within the broader family of giant peoples that includes both Rephaim and Anakim. Deuteronomy had already clarified that the Anakim were considered Rephaim, so the overlap is not contradictory but confirmatory. Goliath stood as a living link to multiple strands of the giant tradition that had haunted Israel since before the conquest. The theological weight of David's victory over Goliath becomes clearer when seen against this background. This was not merely a young man defeating a warrior. It was the completion of a task that began with Joshua and Caleb driving the Anakim from the hill country. The Anakim who fled to Gath had survived for generations, and in Goliath, they produced one final champion who embodied everything Israel once feared. When David struck him down, he was finishing what Joshua could not fully complete and what the faithless generation at Kadesh had refused to begin. The giant from Gath fell as definitively as the sons of Anak had fallen in Hebron, and with him fell the last shadow of the lineage that traced back through Anak to Arba. With Goliath's death and the subsequent elimination of his relatives in Gath, the Anakim disappear from the biblical narrative. No further mention is made of giants dwelling in Gaza, Gath, or Ashdod after David's era. The line that once defined impossibility, that once turned an entire nation away from its inheritance, that once ruled from Hebron as the greatest among the giant peoples, fades into silence. The forefather Anak, whose name became synonymous with fear, left no lasting legacy in the land. His sons were driven out by Caleb, his distant descendants were defeated by David, and the cities that once sheltered his remnants ceased to be known for harboring giants. The pattern that began with the flood, the emergence of giant peoples, their entrenchment in the land and their eventual removal, reached its conclusion in the fields outside Gath. What the waters of judgment had not fully accomplished, what the conquest under Joshua had not completely finished, was resolved in the reign of David. The seed of the promise, traced from Abraham through Judah to the shepherd king, triumphed over the seed of those who had once made Israel tremble. The legacy of Anak dissolved not in a final apocalyptic confrontation, but in a series of individual defeats that, taken together, marked the end of an age. The biblical writers offer no epilogue for the Anakim, no summary statement declaring their lineage extinct. They simply stop appearing in the record after David's victories. The silence is its own conclusion, a narrative choice that allows the giants to fade as they had once emerged, without fanfare, without explanation, leaving only the memory that they had once seemed insurmountable, and yet, in the end, were not. the last genetic echo of Anak's line, if Goliath indeed carried it, fell in the valley of Elah, and with it fell the final claim that giants could stand where God had promised his people would inherit. The story of the Anakim begins and ends with gaps that the texts themselves never close. Genesis speaks briefly of Nephilim in the days before the flood and also afterward, but does not trace a clear line from those early giants to the Anakim who later appear in Canaan. The waters rise, the world is remade around Noah and his sons, and when the land of promise next comes into view, peoples of unusual stature are already present. The narrative moves as if across a broken bridge, acknowledging a continuity it does not explain. In that brokenness, silence becomes part of the testimony. The concentration of Anakim power around Hebron raises similar questions. The city is ancient, older than many of the centers later associated with Israel's kings, and by the time Abraham arrives it already bears the older name Arba, tied to the greatest man among the Anakim. Yet the text offers no account of how or why this particular lineage anchored itself in that hill country rather than elsewhere. The high elevation, the commanding position over surrounding valleys, and the natural defensibility of the site all offer practical reasons, but the writers never pause to supply them. The giants are simply there when the patriarchs arrive, as if they had always been part of the landscape. Later tradition, reflecting back on these silences, turned Hebron into more than a fortress. It became the place of the cave of Machpelah, where Abraham purchased a burial site for Sarah, and where Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Rebekah, and Leah would all be laid to rest. Rabbinic voices meditating on this suggested that the sanctity of Hebron reached even deeper, that Adam and Eve themselves might be buried there, that the city's soil held the beginnings of humanity as well as the fathers of Israel. In such readings, the presence of a giant lineage in Hebron becomes almost symbolic, a powerful, ancient people unconsciously guarding a terrain whose true significance lay not in their strength, but in the bones beneath their feet. Yet the canonical text itself does not make this connection explicit. It allows the association without confirming it. The question of how any giant lineage survived the flood at all remains even more elusive. Some strands of interpretation imagine that corruption re-entered the world through a renewed transgression, that the sons of God again crossed boundaries after the waters receded, producing a second generation of giants unrelated by flesh to those destroyed before. Others propose that the traits of height and power passed through one of Noah's daughters-in-law, carrying forward an unseen echo of the antediluvian world into post-flood genealogies. Still others, more cautious, read the references to Nephilim and Anakim as using shared language for different epochs, evoking memory rather than tracing strict bloodlines. None of these explanations can claim textual certainty. The scriptures themselves refuse to decide among them. The silence does not feel careless. It functions like a veil that allows certain shapes to be seen without inviting fixation. The narrative is less interested in the mechanics of giant survival than in the role these figures play in Israel's testing. The Anakim appear where they must, in Hebron before the Spies, in the hill country before Caleb, in the Philistine cities before David, and then recede. The pattern suggests that whatever their origin, their purpose in the story is to stand at thresholds, between wilderness and inheritance, promise and fear, appearance and trust. How they came to stand there is left in shadow. By withholding explanations, the texts also prevent the giants from becoming the true center of the story. The focus remains on response rather than on origin. The Nephilim before the flood, the Anakim in Canaan, Goliath in Gath, all are presented as real, formidable, and historically located, but none are given the kind of elaborate backstory that would rival the narrative space given to covenant and calling. The silence preserves proportion. It allows the giants to be terrifying, without allowing them to be ultimate. In this way, what is not said becomes as important as what is recorded. The lineage of Anak rises, occupies a city of burial and promise, shapes the fears of a generation, and then is erased without eulogy. Hebron endures, but its meaning shifts from the city of Arba and the sons of Anak to the resting place of patriarchs and the inheritance of Caleb. The text offers clues to how these transitions unfolded, hints of older memories and later reflections, but it never assembles them into a single, definitive account. The reader is left with fragments and the awareness that some questions about survival, concentration, and purpose remain deliberately unanswered. The rabbinic tradition that Adam and Eve were buried in the cave of Machpelah at Hebron offers one reading of why a giant lineage might have concentrated in that particular location. According to this interpretation, the name Kiriath Arba, City of the Four, refers not to Arba the man, but to four couples buried there: Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, Jacob and Leah. The tradition appears in Midrashic literature and is mentioned by the historian Josephus, suggesting it was an old and persistent belief within Jewish interpretive circles. In this view, Hebron becomes the place where humanity began and where the patriarchs chose to end, a soil that held both the origin of the first man and the covenant promises to his distant descendants. If such a tradition had ancient roots, even if not recorded in the canonical text, it might explain why Arba and his descendants anchored themselves at Hebron rather than elsewhere in the hill country. The site would have carried significance that predated Israel's arrival, a sanctity or power associated with burial and beginnings. Giants guarding the resting place of Adam, whether consciously or not, would be a haunting irony. The offspring of corruption watching over the grave of the one from whom all flesh descended. Yet the biblical writers never make this connection explicit, leaving it to later interpreters to propose, while the scripture itself remains focused on Abraham's purchase and the patriarch's interment. The canonical account treats Hebron primarily as the city where Abraham bought the cave at full price from Ephron the Hittite, paying 400 shekels of silver before witnesses to secure a burial place for Sarah. The transaction is detailed, legal, public, a moment of ownership in a land otherwise promised but not yet possessed. That Abraham chose this particular city, already named for the greatest man among the Anakim, is noted without commentary. The text allows the juxtaposition, patriarch purchasing ground from Hittites in a city of giants, without pausing to interpret it. Later, when Isaac and Jacob are also buried in the same cave, Hebron's identity as a patriarchal site deepens, even as the Anakim remain in control of the city above. The bodies of the fathers of Israel rest beneath ground ruled by the sons of Anak, an arrangement that persists for centuries until Caleb finally takes the city by force. The silence of the text on this long coexistence is conspicuous. Neither the patriarchs nor their immediate descendants attempt to displace the Anakim from Hebron, and the giants, for their part, do not disturb the cave where the covenant bearers are entombed. The two realities, covenant burial and giant rule, exist side by side without collision, as if waiting for a later generation to resolve what the earlier ones left suspended. This restraint in the biblical narrative, its refusal to resolve every mystery or connect every thread, serves a theological function. The giants are allowed to be real obstacles without becoming the primary subject. The questions about their origins, their survival, and their specific concentration in Hebron are left partially open, preventing the story from becoming about them rather than about the people called to trust a promise despite their presence. The focus remains on response, how the spies reacted, how the generation at Kadesh chose, how Caleb and David finally acted. The giant's backstory is never as important as Israel's forward movement. The interpretive traditions that later filled in these gaps, speculating about renewed angelic transgressions, genetic inheritance through Noah's line, or the sanctity of Hebron as a burial site for Adam, reflect a natural human desire to close narrative circles. Yet the canonical text's decision not to provide those closures preserves something essential: the acknowledgement that some realities remain opaque even within sacred history. The Anakim appeared, occupied the heart of the Promised Land, became the measure of Israel's fear, and were eventually removed. How they came to be there in the first place, and why Hebron specifically, are questions the text acknowledges by implication, but declines to answer definitively. What the silence preserves, then, is not ignorance but proportion. The story of Anak and his sons is told in fragments precisely because it is not the central story. The central story belongs to Abraham's seed, to the promises made and kept, to the land given and finally possessed. The giants occupy the spaces where faith is tested, at reconnaissance, at Kadesh, at Hebron, at Gath, but they do not occupy the theological center. They are formidable, memorable, and ultimately mortal. The record offers clues about their presence, their lineage, and their defeat, but withholds the kind of comprehensive account that would make them protagonists rather than obstacles. In this way, the biblical treatment of the Anakim becomes a model for how Scripture handles mysteries it does not resolve. It presents them, names them, locates them in history and geography, and then moves forward without pausing to satisfy every curiosity about origins or mechanics. Silence is not evasion but discipline, a refusal to let secondary questions overshadow primary truths. The Anakim mattered because Israel had to face them. Their backstory mattered less because the outcome depended not on where they came from, but on whose promise would prevail. The texts leave the silence intact, and in that silence, preserve the proper focus of the story. Anak's name stands in the text like a stone without inscription. Little is said of his life, nothing of his deeds. He appears only as the son of Arba and the father of 3 sons whose presence in Hebron altered the course of Israel's history. Yet the lack of narrative does not make him insignificant. His importance lies not in recorded action, but in what his existence came to signify. Through him, a lineage took on a single identity. Through his name, an entire people of unusual stature were gathered under one ancestral banner. For Israel, Anak did not mean a man they had met, but a measure by which they weighed their own courage. The spies did not return from Canaan speaking of abstract dangers. They spoke of the sons of Anak, using his name as shorthand for a threshold they believed could not be crossed. In their report, Anak's descendants became the living embodiment of all that seemed beyond reach: fortified cities, ancient lineages, a land that appeared to belong to others more powerful and more deeply rooted than themselves. To call someone of Anak was to place them on the far side of what the human heart could accept as possible. The fear that attached to his name did not arise in a vacuum. When the spies linked the sons of Anak to the Nephilim, they drew on stories older than their own journey, memories of pre-flood giants whose existence had once provoked judgment on a world filled with violence. In their imagination, Anak's line became an echo of that earlier age, a resurgence of a corruption that the waters had been meant to erase. Whether or not the genealogy was literal, the psychological effect was clear. Anak's name came to carry the weight of an ancient dread, that some forces, rooted in times before covenant, might still stand beyond the reach of promise. Yet the same name that crystallized Israel's fear also framed the context in which faith would be revealed. Caleb and Joshua saw the same heights, the same walls, the same sons of Anak, and refused to allow that one name to redefine what God had already spoken. For them, Anak did not cancel Abraham. Hebron remained the place where a promise had been sworn before it was the place where giants dwelt. In their memory, the cave of Machpelah beneath the city carried more weight than the three figures who ruled above it. The question was not whether Anak's sons were tall, but whether their stature could overturn a word given to the patriarchs. When Caleb returned to Hebron decades later, now as an old man, he did so with Anak's name still hanging over the city, but no longer over his own heart. The sons who had once been the argument for retreat were now the appointed objects of inheritance. By driving out Sheshai, Ahiman, and Talmai, Caleb did more than remove three rulers. He severed a genealogical thread that had run from Arba through Anak to the generation that had paralyzed Israel at Kadesh. The land that had been used as evidence against God's reliability became, in that act, the clearest evidence that the earlier fear had been misplaced. In this light, Anak is remembered not for conquest, but for what others made of his line. His name became the standard by which one generation measured impossibility, and the backdrop against which another measured trust. The giants who bore his identity did not write laws, found empires, or speak oracles in the biblical record. Their legacy was psychological. They defined the point at which human vision failed and had to yield to faith or collapse into wandering. Once their cities fell and their line faded, what remained was not admiration for their might, but the memory of how long it took for Israel to believe that such might could fall. The weight of Anak's name, then, is twofold. It carries the inherited fear of an age when boundaries were crossed and giants walked the earth. It also carries the memory of the courage required, at last, to treat that fear as subject rather than sovereign. The forefather of giants, largely silent in the text, becomes a mirror in which Israel's own heart is revealed, first shrinking before what it sees, then, in time, stepping forward to erase from the land a name that was never meant to define the limits of what God could do. The final erasure of Anak's name from the land came not with ceremony, but with the quiet removal of those who carried it. Caleb drove out the three sons from Hebron, and Joshua's campaigns cut off the Anakim from the hill country of Judah and Israel, leaving only scattered remnants in the Philistine cities. No further generations bearing Anak's identity appear in the conquest narratives. The genealogy simply stops, dissolved not by apocalypse but by displacement and defeat. The forefather whose name had once anchored a people's terror became, over time, a name attached to no living community within Israel's borders. When Goliath of Gath later stood against Israel, the text did not call him a son of Anak, though his stature and his origin in one of the cities where Anakim had survived suggested a connection. By that time, the name Anak had receded into the past, replaced by references to Rephaim or simply to the giant. The specific identity that had once paralyzed a generation had given way to a broader category of formidable adversaries who no longer carried the weight of a singular forefather's memory. Anak's name had lost its power not because it was forgotten, but because what it represented had been overcome. The biblical writers preserved the name without glorifying the lineage. Anak appears in genealogical notes, in reconnaissance reports, in retrospective summaries of conquered peoples, but never in hymns or laments. He is not vilified as a great enemy, nor mourned as a tragic figure. He simply is the father who gave his name to a people who stood in the path of Israel's inheritance and whose line was eventually removed. The restraint is striking. In a narrative that often pauses to interpret the significance of key figures, Anak is allowed to remain functional rather than symbolic, a necessary element in the story of conquest, but not its focus. This restraint also means that Anak's story resists being reduced to a single moral lesson. He was not merely an obstacle to be overcome, nor simply a symbol of human pride brought low. His existence raised questions the text never fully answered: why giants reappeared after the flood, why they concentrated in Hebron, whether their presence was a renewed corruption or a natural variation within post-flood humanity. The silence on these matters prevents Anak from becoming either a theological puzzle piece that fits neatly into place or a villain whose defeat resolves all ambiguity. He remains, instead, a figure whose significance lies more in what Israel made of him than in what he made of himself. For the generation that wandered 40 years, Anak's sons became the excuse that justified their refusal. The same report that should have confirmed the promise, "The land flows with milk and honey," was turned into evidence of impossibility because the sons of Anak dwelt there. That generation died without entering, their bones marking the path of their unbelief. For the next generation, however, the name Anak functioned differently. It became the name of what their parents had failed to trust God to overcome, and thus the name of what they themselves must now face. The shift was subtle but decisive, from using Anak as justification for retreat to treating him as the appointed boundary of inheritance. Caleb's conquest of Hebron did not merely claim territory, it renamed the city's meaning in Israel's memory. What had been Arba, the city of the greatest man among the Anakim, became Hebron, the inheritance of the one who had followed the Lord fully. The name of Arba, and by extension the lineage of Anak, was pushed into the past tense, still remembered but no longer determinative. The city that once magnified the stature of giants became the place where faith in the face of giants was rewarded. In that reversal, the weight of Anak's name was finally lifted from the land. Centuries later, readers of the conquest narratives would encounter Anak not as a present threat, but as a memory of a fear that once seemed rational and was eventually revealed as misplaced. His name would serve as a reminder that visible reality, however imposing, is not the final measure of what is possible. The sons of Anak were tall, their cities fortified, their lineage ancient, yet none of this proved sufficient to withstand a promise spoken by God. The forefather of giants, for all the terror his descendants inspired, left behind no kingdom, no monument, no legacy except the lesson that fear of him had been stronger than necessary. In the end, Anak's story is told almost entirely through absence. He does not speak, does not conquer, does not resist. He fathers sons, and those sons inherit his name, and that name becomes a boundary between one generation and the next. The courage required to erase his name from the land was not the courage to face a man. Anak himself was long dead by the time Israel approached Canaan, but the courage to face what his name had come to mean. It meant confronting not just giants, but the belief that giants define the limits of divine promise. When Caleb and David finally removed the last bearers of that lineage, they were not merely winning battles. They were dismantling an interpretation of reality that had cost Israel 40 years. The weight of one name, then, is measured less in the man who bore it than in the generations who struggled with what it signified. Anak, the forefather, gave his identity to a people who became the standard by which Israel's faith was tested. His defeat, enacted through the removal of his sons and the fading of his line, became the proof that what seemed impossible to one generation was, in fact, within reach of the next. He is remembered not for what he built, but for what had to be torn down, a fear rooted in the age before the flood, and a name that for too long carried more authority in Israel's heart than the word of the God who had brought them out of Egypt. When that name was finally erased from the land, what remained was not triumph over a man, but the vindication of a promise that had never been contingent on the absence of giants, only on the presence of the one who had sworn it.